seconds. That's all it is. You've told yourself it's nothing. A hiccup, a tired moment. The kind of thing that happens to anyone on a long day. But you know the truth, don't you? In those 2 seconds, the pause before a name arrives, the silence sitting inside a sentence, you started with full confidence. Something happens that has nothing to do with the clock. A question forms, not loud enough to say out loud, not bold enough to fully acknowledge, just present enough that you feel it, quietly, in the space somewhere behind your chest. Is this getting worse? And then the name comes, and you keep going, and nobody sitting across from you knows what just happened inside you in that moment. But there is a part of you that keeps a record, a quiet record of those moments. Every hesitation, every 2-second reach, every time you smiled and kept talking while something inside you was counting. And that record has been growing. God sees that record too, not to confirm your fear, not to add to the weight of it, but because He placed something inside your mind at the exact moment He formed you, before you ever drew your first breath, that was designed to make those 2 seconds disappear completely. Something researchers at Harvard have spent decades studying, something that NASA has quietly documented in its work on human performance, something the ancient prophets accessed without ever knowing its scientific name. A protein, a building block, the most important substance your brain was designed to produce, and yours is being systematically destroyed, not by your age, not by your lack of faith, not by anything you did or decided or failed to do, by 5 specific forces in modern life that are far more profitable for certain people when your mind stays foggy than when it operates at the clarity God intended. You are not forgetting, chosen one. You are being interfered with. And there is a difference between those 2 things that changes everything, the way you understand your past, the way you step into this season of your life, and the reason God arranged for you to stop here today. Because in 2 Timothy chapter 1 verse 7, God did not say, He gave you a somewhat functional mind on good days. He said He gave you power and love and a sound mind. And the word in the original Greek is sophronismos, and it does not simply mean a brain that is healthy enough. It means a mind with the full capacity to see the complete picture without being distorted by fear, by fog, or by outside interference. A mind operating at its original design. God said, He already gave you that. Not someday, not if you earn it, already. So why does it feel like that is not what you have right now? That is the question this entire message was arranged to answer. Before we go any further, I want to tell you what you will have by the time this ends. You are going to understand exactly what is happening to your mind and why age has far less to do with it than anyone has told you. You are going to learn the names of the specific forces that have been draining your memory protein, and once you can name them, you will never be able to unsee them. You are going to hear what Harvard, Oxford, and researchers working with NASA have confirmed about how the brain restores itself, not over years, but in a matter of days. You are going to leave this message with a framework for reclaiming the mental clarity that God built into you before you were born. And you are going to understand why the shift He has been speaking over your life requires this one thing to be restored first. Stay until the very end. What is coming in this message was not found by accident. And you did not arrive here by accident either. Now, let me show you something. Not a statistic, not a clinical definition, a moment. The kind of moment that doesn't make it into conversations at the dinner table because you cover it over quickly with the next sentence you say, the next sip from your glass, the next nod of your head. You know the moment I'm describing. Maybe it happened at a family gathering, the table full, voices overlapping, someone asking you to tell a story from 30 or 40 years ago, and you opened your mouth because you knew that story. You have told it before. You could feel it, the way. You can feel a room on the other side of a door. The presence of it was familiar. The texture of it was there. You could almost reach it. But the door did not open the way it used to. And instead of the story arriving fully formed the way it always had, it came in pieces, incomplete, like a photograph where the center has slowly faded without you noticing when it happened. So, you filled in the gaps the best you could. You kept going, and no one at the table noticed. But you noticed, and there is something that lives in the noticing, a quiet and specific kind of grief that is different from the frustration of the forgetting itself. It is the grief of watching yourself from the inside, of being fully present in a moment while simultaneously monitoring that moment from a distance, calculating what you revealed and what you managed to conceal, measuring how much the gap between what you intended to say and what you actually said might have showed on your face. That grief has a weight to it that is hard to describe to someone who has not felt it. God knows the weight of it. There is a verse in Psalm 71, verse 9, where David writes, "Do not cast me away when I am old. Do not forsake me when my strength is gone." And when you read that verse alone, in isolation, it can sound like a simple prayer about physical weakness, about knees that ache, and a body that slows. But read what surrounds it. Just 2 verses before, David has been speaking about his mouth, telling of God's righteous acts, of his deeds of salvation all through the years. And 2 verses after, he returns to that same image. "My mouth will tell of your righteousness, of your salvation all day long." David was not simply praying for his health. He was praying for his ability to keep telling the story, to keep being a witness, to remain, in the final chapters of his life, a living and accurate record of what God had done. That is what is at stake in the memory God placed inside you. Not convenience, not comfort, the ability to keep telling the story. And the fact that the telling has been getting harder, the fact that the door to certain memories no longer opens as easily as it once did, is not the natural order of things. It is not what God designed when He formed you. Something is actively working against the design. And we are going to name it. But first I need to acknowledge something, because I know there is a thought that has been sitting underneath everything I've said so far. A thought you haven't said out loud. Not to your doctor, not to your children, maybe not even fully to yourself, in the quiet of your own mind. It goes something like this: "My mother started this way," or "your father, your grandfather, someone in the line before you who you watched over months or years lose something that could not be given back, and you were there for that. You witnessed it up close, the slow erasure, the gradual dimming, and it left a mark on you that goes deeper than you have been willing to admit. Because somewhere in the witnessing, a calculation began. One that no one warned you that you would one day be making about yourself. Late at night, when the house is quiet and there is nothing standing between you and your own thoughts, you have done the math. You have counted backwards from the age they were when you first noticed the signs. You have compared timelines. You have watched yourself, quietly and carefully, for the same early signals. And then morning comes, and you fold that thought away. Because what does it help to sit with it? Because you have people who need you to be okay. Because naming that fear out loud feels, in some deep and irrational way, like giving it permission to become true. So, you fold it away, and it keeps coming back. I want you to hear this, chosen one, and I want it to reach the part of you that has been holding that calculation without anyone to hand it to. God knows about the math you have been doing at 2 in the morning. He is not waiting for you to release the fear before He gives you the answer. He brought you to this exact message in this exact season of your life, because the answer is different from what you have been calculating. Isaiah chapter 46, verse 4. God speaks and says, "Even to your old age I am He. Even when your hair is gray, I will carry you. I have made you, and I will bear you. I will carry you, and I will save you." Look at the pattern Scripture repeats without exception. Moses at 80, standing at a burning bush, receiving the clearest and most consequential divine assignment of his entire life, not in his youth, at the height of his physical strength, but at 80. Caleb, at 85, walking up to the leader of Israel and demanding the mountain God had promised him 40 years before, declaring that he was just as strong for the mission now as he had ever been. Anna, who had been a widow for most of her long life, standing in the temple courts at the age of 84, sharp enough, spiritually clear enough, present enough to recognize the Messiah when he arrived as a 40-day-old infant in his mother's arms. God does not design his chosen ones to dim at this stage of life. What you are experiencing is not the natural order. It is interference with an order God designed. And there is a profound difference between a mind that is declining and a mind that is being blocked. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 21, the father writes to his son, "Do not let wisdom and understanding out of your sight." And the Hebrew word used for letting something out of your sight is natsar. And natsar does not describe a single dramatic moment of loss. It describes something slipping away gradually, unnoticed, the way a slow leak empties a reservoir. You were certain was full steadily, systematically, without ever announcing itself loud enough for you to respond. That is exactly how the loss of your memory protein works. Not all at once, not from a single event you could point to. Quietly, over months and years, the very substance God placed in your brain to preserve your wisdom and your stories and your ability to receive and hold His word, that substance has been slowly draining. And now I want to tell you what has been draining it. Because if you have been paying attention to your own mind, and I know you have, because you are someone who notices, then you have probably already tried to do something about it. Maybe you downloaded one of those brain training apps, the kind that arrives with a promise, 10 minutes a day of puzzles, and your mind will sharpen. Maybe you added fish oil to your morning, omega-3. Perhaps one of the supplements that fills entire shelves at the pharmacy under the label of memory support. Maybe someone you trust told you that crosswords are the answer, or learning a new language, or picking up an instrument. And maybe you tried some of these things, sincerely, consistently, for months. And I want to honor that. The impulse to fight back, to not simply accept what was happening and look for something to do that impulse, is right. It comes from a God-given drive to protect what He placed in you. But here is what none of those programs told you. Every single one of them was addressing the symptom, not the root. Every puzzle, every supplement, every regimen was working at the surface of a problem whose source goes far deeper than any of them were ever designed to reach. It is like mopping the floor of a room while the pipe behind the wall is still cracked. You can mop every morning, you can mop faster, use a better mop, switch brands, add a second mop, and the floor will be wet again by the next morning, without fail, because you were never doing anything about the leak. The wellness industry, the industry that produces those apps and those supplements and those memory training protocols, operates on an assumption. That assumption is that what is happening to your mind is a natural process, something built into biology, something that can be slowed with the right habits, but never truly interrupted at the root. That assumption is not just incomplete, it is wrong. Romans chapter 12, verse 2, Paul writes, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." And that word for renewing in the Greek original is anakainosis. And anakainosis does not mean renovation, does not mean patching what has broken down. It comes from the root kainos, which means to return something to its original as-made state, to remove what has accumulated and restore what existed before the interference began. Not improvement, restoration. That is the word God chose for what is available to your mind. And in the book of Daniel, chapter 1, verse 17, we read that God gave knowledge and understanding to Daniel and his companions, not as a reward for their discipline alone, not as a natural result of their good habits, but as a direct activation of something in the architecture of their thinking. God configured their minds for the assignment he had placed before them. And the ancient sage Job, who had walked through more loss than most of us will ever face, wrote in chapter 12, verse 12, "Is not wisdom found among the aged? Does not long life bring understanding?" The implied answer God intends is yes, a full, unqualified, undiminished yes. So, why has your experience been telling you something different? Because the apps and the programs and the supplements were never the problem. You were never failing at the level of effort or discipline or commitment. You were being failed at the level of root cause. Every program, every pill, every brain training routine you have ever tried, they were all addressing the wrong target. The real target has a name, and when you understand what that name is, everything you thought you knew about why your mind has been feeling the way it has is going to shift completely. The real target has a name, and the name is not aging, it is not genetics, it is not the natural course of time, doing what time does. The name is BDNF, Brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Now, I know what happens when someone drops a term like that into a conversation. The mind goes a little distant. It starts to feel like a lecture, like something from a textbook you never asked to open. So I want to tell you what that name actually means before we go any further, because when you understand what it does, you will stop hearing it as science and start hearing it as something else entirely. BDNF is the protein your brain produces to build new brain cells, to strengthen the connections between the cells that already exist, and to take what you experience today and convert it into a memory you can actually reach tomorrow. It is the mechanism by which the things you learn, the things you live through, the things God speaks to you in the quiet of the morning become something permanent, something storable, something retrievable. Harvard researchers spent years studying it and eventually called it something that does not sound like it belongs in a research paper. They called it miracle grow for the brain, because that is, as precisely as any metaphor can capture it, what it does. It grows things, it sustains things, it keeps the garden alive, and God put it there. Not as a biological accident, not as a random feature of evolution. He placed it in the architecture of your mind, the way he placed roots in a tree, because he designed you to grow in wisdom as you age, not to fade, not to slow, not to lose ground in the very decades when your depth of experience should be at its fullest and most powerful. In Daniel chapter 1, verse 17, the scripture does not just say that Daniel became smart. It says, God gave knowledge and understanding to Daniel and his companions. The word gave is intentional. God was not simply blessing their study habits. He was activating something in the design of their minds. The same BDNF that science has only recently been able to name and study, God has been working with since the first mind he ever formed. And in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 6, when God says that his commandments are to be on your hearts, the Hebrew word used for heart is levavka, from the root lev. And lev in ancient Hebrew was not simply the seat of emotion, it was the seat of memory, the deep storage, the sacred archive where what matters most is kept safe, accessible, alive. God was not asking you to mentally acknowledge his words and move on. He was asking you to let them take root in the part of you he specifically designed to hold what is most important, the lev, the place where BDNF does its deepest work. So, when that protein diminishes, the effect is not simply that names arrive slower or stories take longer to surface. The effect runs deeper than that. The lev thins. The sacred archive becomes harder to access. The words God has spoken to you over decades of relationship, the encounters, the moments of clarity, the dreams that felt like more than dreams, all of it becomes a little more distant, a little harder to retrieve, a little more like a door you know exists but cannot always find. That is not aging. That is interference with a design God built specifically to last your entire lifetime and beyond. And now I need to tell you where that interference is coming from, because here is what I think you already suspect, even if you have never had a name for it. The decline you have been experiencing did not come from nowhere. It followed a pattern, and the pattern follows the exact shape of 5 specific forces that are embedded in how modern life is structured. Not random forces, not bad luck, specific, nameable, completely avoidable forces that are, and I want you to sit with this, significantly more profitable for certain industries when your memory protein stays low than when it operates at the level God designed it for. Let me walk you through them, and as I do, I want you to trace each one back to your own morning, because I think you are going to recognize all 5 before I finish. The first force works like this. You wake up, and before you have fully surfaced from sleep, before your brain has had time to ease gently into its own natural chemistry, something happens. Maybe it is a notification. Maybe it is a headline. Maybe it is just the habit of reaching for the phone before your feet hit the floor, and in 30 seconds you are holding a piece of news that your body reads as a threat. Your adrenal system responds the way it was designed to respond to threats, by flooding your system with cortisol. And cortisol, when it arrives in sustained doses like this, is the single most destructive chemical your brain can be bathed in on a regular basis. It does not just put you on edge. It actively dismantles the architecture that BDNF is trying to build. Every sustained cortisol flood is a demolition crew working against the construction crew God placed in your mind. And for most people in this generation, that demolition crew is called in first thing every morning. The second force arrives with food, specifically with the kind of food that has displaced, the kind of food your grandparents ate, the highly processed grains, the refined sugars, the things that arrive in packages and have shelf lives measured in years rather than days. When blood sugar spikes fast and then crashes and then spikes again in the cycle that refined carbohydrates create, it triggers something called neural inflammation. The brain swells slightly at a cellular level, and that inflammation is BDNF's second great enemy. It does not kill brain cells dramatically. It suffocates them slowly, the way fog smothers a landscape without ever landing a single visible blow. The third force is blue light after dark, the screens that most people in this generation sit in front of for the final 2 to 4 hours of each day. The television, the phone, the tablet emit a specific frequency of light that tells the brain's internal clock that the sun has not yet set. And the brain, operating on that false signal, suppresses melatonin production. And it is during deep sleep, specifically the slow wave cycles that melatonin helps initiate, that BDNF is most actively synthesized, not just used, made. Your brain's window for producing the memory protein God designed closes every time deep sleep is disrupted. And, for most people in modern life, it is disrupted most nights by a screen they did not know was making the decision for them. The fourth force is one that nobody talks about in the context of memory, but that I believe is one of the most significant for this generation specifically. It is isolation. Not loneliness in the dramatic sense, but the slow withdrawal from meaningful, face-to-face human connection that has accelerated over the last 20 years. Researchers studying BDNF levels have found that social isolation is one of the fastest and most reliable ways to drive the protein down faster than diet, faster than sleep disruption alone. Because the brain was designed, from its foundation, to be activated by relationship, by proximity to other minds, by the specific kind of stimulation that only happens when you are genuinely present with another person, reading their face, responding to their words, being seen, and seeing in return. When that diminishes, the brain reads it as a form of threat, and it conserves energy in ways that cost you the very protein that keeps your stories alive. The fifth force is the one I want you to pay the most attention to, because it is the most personal and the most insidious of them all. It is the quiet withdrawal from the sacred practices that kept your mind in its highest state of activation. The morning reading of scripture, the extended prayer, the moments of stillness in which your brain, without your consciously knowing it, was entering precisely the kind of meditative state that research has now confirmed produces the highest natural spikes in BDNF. The prophets were not just praying. They were, without the vocabulary of neuroscience to describe it, doing something to their brains that modern science has only recently been able to measure. And when the busyness of life crowds out those practices, when the Bible, that used to be the first thing you opened in the morning, now sits on the table and gets to you later, or, sometimes, not at all. One of the most powerful BDNF activation mechanisms God built into your life goes quiet. So you see what I am describing. This is not a story about your body failing. It is a story about 5 very specific forces: stress news in the morning, processed food at every meal, screens after dark, thinning human connection, and the slow withdrawal from the sacred that have quietly, systematically, over months and years, been doing to your memory protein what a slow leak does to a foundation. Not a single catastrophic event, just steady, consistent, profitable interference. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 12, carries a warning that now sounds different than it did the first time you read it. God says, "Be careful that you do not forget the Lord." And the careful in that verse is not a gentle suggestion. In the Hebrew, it carries the weight of active watchfulness, of a guard who does not step away from his post. Because God knew. He knew that the things designed to pull you away from the practices that kept your mind sharp and your spirit clear would not arrive with a declaration. They would arrive quietly, softly, one screen at a time. One skipped morning at a time, one headline at a time, until the well that he had designed to be full was significantly lower than either you or he intended. Now I want to show you something that changes the entire emotional temperature of this conversation. Because everything I have just described, the 5 forces, the interference, the slow draining of what God placed in you, it might sound like a long list of bad news, and I want you to know that it is not even slightly. Because here is what the interference model means, if you have been following. If your BDNF is not low because of aging, then aging cannot be the ceiling of what is possible for your mind. And if your BDNF is low because of specific, nameable forces acting on it from the outside, then removing or disrupting those forces changes the equation completely. Your brain never forgot how to make BDNF. It was never the problem, it was silenced. And science has been studying people for whom that silencing did not happen, or for whom something reversed it. And what they found in those studies is so far outside what we have been told to expect about aging, that researchers had to create a separate category just to describe them. They call them superagers. Men and women in their 80s and 90s whose brains, when scanned, show the cellular thickness and the neural connectivity of people decades younger, who score as well on memory tests as 30-year-olds, sometimes better, who walk into rooms knowing exactly why they came, who carry names and faces and stories with a fluency that most 50-year-olds have already started to lose. Scientists were so unsettled by these people that they dedicated entire research programs to understanding them. What were they doing differently? What did their biology have that the rest of the population was missing? The answer was not a particular gene. It was not a specific diet, though diet mattered. It was not exceptional discipline. It was BDNF levels that were not just preserved, but, in some cases, actively higher than those of people half their age. One of those superagers, a woman studied at 91 years old, was asked by the researcher conducting her session if she could recall the births of her grandchildren. There were 11 of them. She did not pause. She began to describe each one, not in general terms, not with the vagueness of a memory that has been summarized over time, but with specific detail: the day, the weight, the first sound they made, what she whispered to each one when she first held them. 11 children, across decades, recalled with the clarity of someone describing something that happened last spring. The researcher asked her what she attributed her memory to. She said she never fought her mind. She said she had always tried to give it what it needed. Every morning, she said, she had a practice, a quiet practice. 17 minutes, she said. Before the noise of the day began, she did not have a scientific name for what she was doing. She just knew that certain sounds and certain stillness brought her a kind of clarity that lasted through the day. Science has now found the name for what she was doing, and this is where everything changes. Researchers studying neural entrainment, the way the brain's own electrical rhythms respond to and begin to synchronize with external sound frequencies, made a discovery at a research center in China that quietly rewrote what the scientific community thought it knew about BDNF activation. They found that a specific combination of sound frequencies, delivered for just 17 minutes, produced a measurable and significant increase in BDNF production in the brain. Not over weeks, not as the result of months of practice. In a single session of 17 minutes, the brain responded to those frequencies the way a sleeping instrument responds. To the right note, it woke up, and it began to do what it was designed to do. Not meditation, though meditation matters. Not cardio, though movement has value. Not a supplement that has to cross the blood-brain barrier through a digestive system that may or may not cooperate. Sound. 17 minutes of the right sound, and the brain's own BDNF production mechanism reactivated. Now, what I am about to share with you is not a product. I want to be clear about what this is before I describe it, because the word that fits it best is not product, and it is not supplement, and it is not a program. The word that fits it best is recalibration, a returning to design, a removal of the interference, so that what God built into you can begin, again, to do exactly what He built it to do. Dr. James Rivers has spent 34 years as a neuroscientist studying human cognition and the conditions under which the brain operates at its highest capacity. His work has brought him into research contexts that include NASA's programs on human performance under extreme conditions, because what NASA needed to understand how to keep a human mind sharp, clear, and fully functional under circumstances designed to degrade, it turns out to be exactly the same question that men and women in their 50s, 60s, and 70s are quietly asking themselves every morning. What Dr. Rivers developed from the research findings at Shaanxi, refined through years of testing and documented results, is what he calls the brain song. It is a 17-minute sound frequency delivered through headphones designed to be experienced lying down in a state of rest. You do not need to meditate. You do not need to clear your mind, or follow a breathing protocol, or learn anything new. You lie back and you listen, and the sound frequencies do what they were discovered to do. They speak to the architecture of your brain in a language your brain was designed from its creation to respond to, and they activate the production of the memory protein God placed in you. The ancient prophets entered states of neural clarity through fasting and extended prayer, through the specific quality of stillness and sacred sound that those practices created in the body and mind. Modern neuroscience has now identified the frequency of that clarity, and it has found a way to deliver it in 17 minutes to anyone, regardless of how long the interference has been running. The brain song is not adding anything to you that was not already there. It is removing the noise. It is recalibrating your brain back to the design God built into it before the cortisol, before the processed food, before the blue light and the isolation and the crowded mornings with no room for stillness. The superager at 91 was not special. She was simply operating closer to her original design than most people around her. And so was Daniel. And so was Caleb at 85, claiming a mountain. And so can you. But here is what I have not told you yet. This is not just about remembering names. It is not just about following a conversation at the dinner table or walking into a room and knowing why you came, as important as all of that is. There is something deeper that God placed inside your memory, something specific, something that belongs not just to you, but to the people who come after you and the generation that is still waiting to inherit what you carry. And what you are about to understand is why recovering your memory is not just about your quality of life. It is about completing something God started through you. There is something deeper that God placed inside your memory, something that goes far beyond the practical question of whether you can recall a name quickly or hold a thread in a fast-moving conversation. To understand what it is, I need to show you how memory actually works, not in the biological sense, not as neurons and pathways and protein levels, but in the way that matters most to the life you are living and the legacy you are in the middle of building. Your memory is not one thing. It is three things, layered on top of each other, each one serving a different and irreplaceable purpose in your life as a chosen one. The first layer is your personal memory. This is the one most people think about when they notice their memory changing. Names, dates, where you left your keys, the sequence of events from last Thursday. This layer is the surface, and it is real, and it matters, but it is the least of the three in terms of what is at stake for you at this stage of your life. The second layer is your generational memory. This is the deeper layer that holds the stories your family needs from you, not just pleasant anecdotes, not just entertainment for Sunday afternoons, but the actual record of where your line has been, what God has done in it, what was survived and how, what was learned and passed forward, and what was lost and should not be lost again. This is the layer that connects your grandchildren to something larger than their own small experience of the world, something that gives them roots deep enough to hold them steady when the ground shakes under their feet. And the third layer is your sacred memory. This is the deepest layer of all, and it is the one the enemy is most interested in reaching. The sacred layer holds every divine encounter you have ever had. Every moment when God spoke to you with a clarity that left no room for doubt. Every prayer that was answered in a way you never expected. Every time you felt his presence in a circumstance that had no good reason to resolve the way it did. Every word he placed in your spirit during a season of waiting that you held on to like a handhold in the dark. This is not casual information. This is the archive of your relationship with God, stored in the deepest structure of your mind, available to be recalled and re-experienced and passed forward with the full weight of your testimony behind it. When BDNF declines, all three layers are affected, but the order of loss matters. The personal layer thins first names, dates, sequences. Then, the generational layer becomes harder to access. The stories arrive slower, less detailed, less alive. And then, quietly, gradually, the sacred layer begins to recede. The encounters feel less vivid. The words God spoke feel more distant. The memories of his faithfulness become harder to hold with the kind of certainty that makes them useful in the present. And this is what I need you to understand, that receding is not spiritual dryness. It is not a loss of faith. It is the biological consequence of a brain operating below the design God gave it, trying to maintain 3 layers of irreplaceable memory on a protein level too low to sustain all of them fully. As your BDNF begins to be restored each morning through the 17-minute practice, the layers return in the same order. They were lost, but in reverse. Personal memory sharpens first, and people around you begin to notice it. Then, the generational stories start to surface with more detail, more color, more of the texture that makes them worth telling. And then the sacred layer begins to come alive again. The encounters become vivid. The testimony feels present tense rather than historical. The confidence of remembered faithfulness returns. Job, in chapter 12, verse 12, asked a question that was not really a question, it was a declaration. "Is not wisdom found among the aged?" he wrote. "Does not long life bring understanding?" He was describing the accumulated weight of all 3 layers: personal wisdom, generational wisdom, sacred wisdom, the full depth of a life lived in awareness of God. That is what God designed your memory to hold and to carry forward. And that is what is being reclaimed. Now, I want to give you something practical, because understanding what is happening is only half of what you need. You also need to know how to position yourself to receive the recalibration that God has prepared for this season of your life, and specifically, how to create the conditions in your daily life in which BDNF restoration can take hold as fully and as quickly as possible. I want to give you 5 anchors, 5 specific, simple adjustments that you can begin applying without adding a single, complicated thing to your already full life. Because these are not about doing more. They are about removing interference from what your brain was already designed to do. The first anchor is this: protect the first 10 minutes of your morning from information that arrives as threat. Do not reach for news. Do not scroll through a feed of other people's emergencies before your own mind has had a chance to settle into its own natural chemistry. The cortisol that floods your system in those first 10 minutes of threat information does more damage to that day's BDNF production than almost anything else you will encounter. The brain wakes slowly and sacredly, and it was designed to ease into the day through a window of natural quiet. Guard that window. Not for hours, 10 minutes is enough to make a measurable difference. Let the first thing your mind engages with be something that opens rather than something that closes. The second anchor is about what you eat, and I am not going to give you a complicated diet protocol because that is not what this is about. The single most impactful dietary shift you can make for your BDNF levels is this: reduce the refined sugar and the processed white flour that create the blood sugar spikes and crashes that trigger neural inflammation. You do not have to eliminate them. You do not have to follow a specific plan. You simply need to become aware, in a way you perhaps were not before, that every significant spike is followed by a crash, and every crash is accompanied by a brief inflammatory response in the brain that costs you something from the protein level God designed you to maintain. Make that substitution one meal at a time, one choice at a time. That is enough. The third anchor is to restore deep sleep by moving the screens earlier in the evening. Not out of your life, simply earlier. Ending screen exposure 60 to 90 minutes before you sleep gives your brain enough time to begin the melatonin production. It was designed to initiate naturally, which opens the slow-wave sleep window in which BDNF is synthesized most actively. Your brain is trying to make memory protein for you every night. It just needs the window to do it. Give it that window, and it will use it. The fourth anchor is connection. Intentional, face-to-face, or voice-to-voice connection with people who matter to you, pursued not as a social obligation, but as a biological necessity and a spiritual practice. Call the friend you have been meaning to call. Show up at the gathering you have been thinking about skipping. Have the long conversation instead of the quick check-in. Your brain was designed to be activated by genuine human presence, and every hour of real connection is an hour of BDNF support that no supplement can replicate. And the fifth anchor, and this is the one I want you to hold most carefully, is the return to the sacred practice that your mornings have been missing. Not a complicated new discipline, not a longer quiet time than you have time for. Simply the intentional act of returning your first alert, unhurried attention each morning to God, to His Word, and to the kind of stillness in which He has always spoken most clearly. The research confirms what the prophets always knew. This specific state of mind, calm, receptive, spiritually oriented, is one of the highest natural conditions for BDNF activation that exists. You were not just praying when you did this. You were, without knowing the science behind it, giving your brain exactly what it needed to operate at the design God intended. In 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 12, we find Elijah standing at the mouth of a cave after a fire and an earthquake and a great wind, and God was not in any of them. And then, after all of that noise and force, there was a still, small voice, a gentle whisper, and the Hebrew behind that phrase is literally a voice of fine silence. A sound so quiet that it could only be heard by a mind that had become still enough to receive it. This is the frequency at which God most often speaks. Not in the earthquake, not in the spectacle, in the fine silence. And the brain that is overloaded with cortisol and inflammation and disrupted sleep rhythms and thinning connection cannot access that frequency easily. It is not that God stopped speaking, the receiver was turned down. The 17-minute morning activation works most powerfully when it immediately precedes your prayer and scripture time, because what it does in those 17 minutes is prime your brain for exactly the kind of receptive stillness that the fine silence requires. Your BDNF levels are elevated, your neural pathways are activated, your brain is operating closer to its original design, and you sit down to meet God with a mind that can actually hear Him. That is not a coincidence. That is a design. Now I want to do something that many messages like this one never do. I want to slow down, and I want to look at something uncomfortable. Because everything I have shared with you so far has been about understanding and about tools and about the science of what is happening and how to address it, and all of that is real, and all of it matters. But there is something underneath the desire to restore your memory that we have not yet looked at directly. And until we do, the 5 anchors and the 17-minute practice and all the understanding in the world will only take you so far. Let me describe something to you. It is a Sunday afternoon. The family is gathered, which does not happen as often as it used to, because everyone is busy now, and distance has grown between the generations in the way that it does when life accelerates. But today, they are here, around the table, and the conversation is moving the way it does when people who love each other have not been in the same room for a while, fast, layered, full of references and callbacks, and the kind of shorthand that only families have. And someone, maybe a grandchild, maybe a son or daughter-in-law, who married into the family and is still learning its history, asks you something, a simple question about the past. Something you have been the keeper of for decades, and the table goes a little quiet, because this is a story that belongs to you, and everyone knows it belongs to you, and they are waiting for you to begin. And you begin, and something in you knows, even as you start, that the version you are about to tell is thinner than it used to be, that the details which used to arrive without effort are arriving more slowly or not arriving at all, that the texture of it is missing in places, and you are filling those places with general statements where there used to be specific ones. And around the table, no one says anything. Everyone listens with the same warmth they always have, and to them the story was fine. It was good. It was enough. But you know. And in the hours after the family goes home, there is a specific kind of quiet that settles over the house, that is not just the ordinary quiet of an empty room. It is the quiet of someone sitting with something they cannot quite name, a loss that is too small to grieve out loud, but too persistent to ignore. That quiet has a name. It is the grief of feeling like you are becoming less of yourself. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the small and specific ways that only you can measure, because you are the only one with access to the full version of what you used to be. I want to tell you something about that grief, not to bypass it or minimize it or spiritualize it into something more comfortable, but to tell you the truth about it, which is this: that grief is holy. It is the response of a person who understands, at a deep and sacred level, that what is being lost is not trivial. The detail that slipped from the story at the Sunday table, that was not just a word that got away, that was a thread in the tapestry of your family's history. And the part of you that grieved its absence was not being overly sensitive. It was being accurate about the weight of what it is to be a keeper of a story, and what it costs when the keeping becomes harder. In Psalm 71, verse 9, David's prayer, "Do not forsake me when my strength is gone," was precisely this, not a prayer born from weakness, a prayer born from the recognition of what was at stake if the strength to carry the story forward faded. David was not asking God to preserve his comfort. He was asking God to preserve his capacity to keep bearing witness, to keep telling what God had done, to remain, in the evening of his life, a person whose testimony still had full power in it. That is your prayer too, and it is a prayer God already answered before you knew to ask it. But here is what I need you to stay with for a moment before we continue, because there is something that the grief at the Sunday table is covering, something underneath the sadness of the thinning story, something that is a little harder to acknowledge than the grief itself. It is the fear of what other people at that table might be thinking, not whether they noticed the gap in the story. Most of them did not, and the ones who did would never say so. But the fear lives anyway, in the space between how you presented yourself and how you know you actually are. And that space, the gap between the face you show and the reality you are quietly managing, takes energy to maintain. Enormous, invisible energy that drains from you over the course of every family gathering, every conversation where you are trying to track faster than your brain is currently equipped to track, every moment of pretending that everything is fine when something in you knows it is not quite what it was. And what that energy drain means, what the maintenance of that gap costs you, is that the exhaustion you feel after social interactions that used to leave you energized is not a sign of introversion or age or diminished capacity for relationship. It is the tax that hiding a vulnerability you did not ask to carry charges you, every time, without exception. Romans chapter 12, verse 2. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. The anakinosis Paul described is not just a biological process, it is also the slow, steady removal of the need to hide. Because when the mind is operating at its design, when the memory protein is doing what God created it to do, the gap closes. The face you show and the reality you are living begin to match each other again. And the energy that was going into maintaining the distance between them becomes available for something else entirely. I want to ask you something, and I want you to let it land somewhere real before you answer it. In your mind right now, without speaking it out loud, think about the last time you felt invisible at a table full of people who love you. Not dramatic invisibility, the quiet kind. The kind that happens when the conversation moved faster than you could follow, or when you repeated something you had already said and watched someone's expression register it, or when you smiled and nodded rather than risk asking for clarification on something you should have caught. Let that moment be present for a second. If that moment is real to you, if you recognized yourself in any part of what I just described, I want you to do something simple. In the comments, write the word seen, not because it will fix anything on its own, but because the act of saying that you were seen, that someone named the thing you have been carrying quietly, matters. God sees every one of those moments at the table. Every smile that covered an uncertainty, every laugh that bought you a few more seconds. He collected every single one. And he brought you here because those moments are numbered. Not because more are coming, but because the design he built into you was meant to make them stop. In Isaiah chapter 46 verse 4, God said, "I will carry you even to your old age and gray hairs." And the word carry there in the original language is nasa, and it means to lift something up and transport it from where it was to where it needs to be. God was not saying he would keep you from decline. He was saying he would pick up what was struggling under its own weight and move it forward, actively, personally, with the same hands that formed you. There is a shadow side to memory restoration that nobody ever warns you about. And if you do not understand it before it arrives, it has the power to stop you before you have barely begun. And it is coming in the next part of this message. The shadow side of memory restoration is this. Most people who begin to reclaim their mind discover something they were not prepared for. They discover that somewhere along the way, in the months or years of quietly managing the decline, they built something. Not intentionally, not consciously, but they built it the way anyone builds anything they depend on for survival. Carefully, steadily, one small adjustment at a time. They built a version of themselves designed to function inside the limitation. A version that deflects certain questions before they can be asked. A version that steers conversations away from the territory where the gaps are most likely to show. A version that has become so practiced at covering the distance between what it was and what it is now that the covering has started to feel like the truth. And here is what nobody tells you about that. When the memory begins to return, when the BDNF levels rise and the stories start arriving with their detail intact, and the names come before the silence, does that carefully built structure has to be let go of. And letting go of something you built for your own protection, even when you no longer need it, is not as simple as it sounds. That is the shadow side. And it begins with the one layer of the shadow that most people have never let themselves examine directly. There is a specific fear that lives in this generation of chosen ones. It is not the fear of forgetting in general. It is more specific than that, and more personal, and considerably more frightening once you allow yourself to look at it without flinching. It is the fear that what is happening to you is not interference at all. It is the fear that it is inheritance. You watched someone, maybe more than one person, someone in your bloodline, someone whose face carried features that your own face carries, someone whose laugh you hear sometimes in your own laugh, and you watch them begin to lose what you are now beginning to lose. You watched the process from the outside, and you were close enough to it to understand what was happening before they did, and you watched how the people around them managed it with love, yes, with patience, yes, but also with a kind of quiet sorrow that they tried to keep out of their eyes when they were in the room with them. And you learned, from watching that, what the progression looks like. You learned the early signs. You catalogued them without meaning to, and now you find yourself, on certain nights, checking yourself against that catalogue. The thought arrives, usually after one of the 2-second pauses, usually after a moment that was just noticeable enough to register. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself with alarm or panic. It arrives quietly, in the same tone of voice your own thinking uses, and it says something like, "This is how it started for her," or, "I remember noticing this in him around this age." And then it goes quiet again, and you go back to the conversation or the meal or whatever was happening before the thought arrived. But it leaves something behind, a residue, a slight shift in the quality of the air around your own future. I want to speak to that thought directly, not around it, not about it from a safe distance, directly to it. The thought that says, "This is how it started for her," is not wrong to notice what it noticed. The noticing itself is not the problem. Attention is not fear. Awareness is not surrender. The part of you that has been watching carefully is doing what careful, intelligent people do when they care about the outcome. But here is what the thought is getting wrong. It is treating inheritance as destiny. It is treating the path of the person you watched as the default path, the one you are on, unless something dramatic intervenes to put you on a different one. And that is the lie embedded inside the fear. Because BDNF decline is not written into your DNA the way eye color is. It is not a sentence handed down through generations with no possibility of appeal. It is the result of conditions, and conditions can be changed. It is the result of an environment that has been draining a specific protein from the brain for decades, and that environment is not your bloodline. It is the world you both were living in, you and the person you watched, the same world, the same cortisol floods, the same processed food, the same disrupted sleep, the same thinning of the practices that once kept the sacred layer alive and active. The fear that says you are on their path is confusing shared environment with shared fate, and it is not true. Isaiah chapter 46 verse 4, "Even to your old age, I am he," God said, "and even to gray hairs, I will carry you. I have made you, and I will bear you. I will carry you, and I will save you." The word translated carry here is nasa, and it does not describe passive maintenance. It describes the act of physically lifting something from the ground and transporting it to a new location. God was not promising to slow your decline. He was promising to pick you up from where you were struggling and move you somewhere. Your own strength could not have taken you alone. That is not the language of inevitability. That is the language of intervention. But there is a layer deeper than the fear of inheritance. And this is the one that is most rarely spoken and most rarely addressed, even in conversations that try to go deep. because this layer is not really about memory at all. It only appears to be. At its core, this layer is a question about God. Specifically, it is this: if He designed me for clarity, if He placed the memory protein inside me and called it a gift, if the scripture says He gave me a sound mind and wisdom for this season, then where has He been while all of this was happening? Why did He let the 5 forces drain what He designed? Why did He not intervene before the stories started thinning and the names started arriving slower and the sacred layer started feeling further away? Why, if He is the one who said He would carry me, does it feel like I have been carrying this alone? That question is real. It is not faithless to ask it. It is, in fact, one of the most honest prayers a person can bring to God, the kind of prayer that David brought repeatedly, without apology, in the very Psalms that God chose to preserve for every generation that came after. And I want to give you the answer to it. Not a theological deflection. The actual answer: God did not let this happen to you. What happened to you happened in a world that is not operating according to His design, in a culture that has been systematically dismantling the conditions under which His design functions, in a body living inside an environment that was shaped by forces He did not create and did not endorse. He is not the architect of the interference. He is the one who arranged for you to be sitting here, in this specific moment, hearing the name of the interference for the first time and understanding that it can be removed. The fact that you are here, the fact that you did not scroll past, the fact that something in you stopped and listened, the fact that you have stayed through everything this message has asked you to sit with, that is not coincidence. That is what NASA looks like in real time. That is God picking something up from where it had been set down and carrying it forward. That is the intervention you were wondering about. It did not look like what you expected, because it rarely does. It looked like a message, on an ordinary day, in a quiet moment. But it was arranged. In your mind right now, let that land somewhere real. Not as an idea, as a fact. Say it to yourself, not out loud, but in the deepest room of your thinking, where the real conversations happen. He did not forget me. He was carrying me to this moment. Let that be there. Now I want to show you what that kind of divine carry looks like in the life of someone who received it. There is a man I want to tell you about. He is not a celebrity. He is not a pastor or a public figure. He is someone whose story I am sharing, the way stories like this deserve to be shared, with the specific details that make it real, and with the honest acknowledgement that his experience is not a guarantee of any particular outcome for anyone else, but a testimony of what becomes possible when interference is removed and design is allowed to do what it was always intended to do. His name, for the sake of this telling, is Harold. He was 67 years old when the change began to be undeniable. Not the change in his mind that had been gradual, as it always is, so gradual that he had been the last to name it. The change that was undeniable was in his relationship with his church community, which he had served and been known by for most of his adult life. Harold had always been the one people called when they needed someone who remembered. He was the unofficial historian of the congregation. He knew which families had been there for 3 generations and which ones had arrived last year. He knew the stories behind the names on the memorial plaques in the foyer. He knew what year the building had been expanded and what had been prayed over in that season, and what God had done in response to that prayer. He carried all of it without effort, the way a person carries something so long it no longer feels like weight. And then, over the course of about 18 months, he began to notice that the carrying was becoming effort. Not enough for anyone else to register it clearly, but enough that he knew. Enough that, when someone asked him something he should have known instantly, There was a pause he was not used to having, a reaching, and then either the answer or a careful redirect to something adjacent. He became skilled at the redirect. He became, in fact, expert at it, the way people become expert at anything they practice daily out of necessity. What Harold told me was that the part that stayed with him longest was not the forgetting. It was the morning he sat in his usual chair at his usual time, with his Bible open to the passage he had read 100 times before, and the passage felt like it was behind glass. He could see the words. He knew what they said. But the living quality that used to rise from them, the sense that they were addressed to him specifically on that specific morning, the feeling of being met by something real inside the text, that quality was absent. And he sat there for a while, feeling its absence, and then he closed the Bible and went to make coffee and did not go back to it that morning. He told me that was the moment he knew something was wrong with more than just his memory. Harold began the 17-minute morning practice on a Tuesday in early March. He did not tell anyone he was doing it, because he was not yet sure what he thought about it, and because the part of him that had been managing the decline privately wanted to manage this the same way, quietly, alone, before he had results worth reporting. On the third morning, something happened that he described with a precision that I have thought about many times since he told me. He said he was sitting with his Bible after the 17 minutes, in the same chair, at the same time, with the same passage open in front of him, and the glass was gone. Not the words had always been there. The glass, the distance, the sense of reading about something rather than being addressed by it, that was gone. The passage was alive in the way it had always been alive before the slow dimming began, and he sat with it for a long time. Not because he was trying to, but because he could not make himself get up and go do something else. He said, "I did not just get my memory back, I got my mornings back." By the end of the first week, the names that had been arriving slowly were arriving at their original speed. By the end of the second week, he was back in the role of the person others called when they needed someone who remembered. But this time, the weight he was carrying felt like the old weight, the kind that is not weight at all, because it is carried by something stronger than personal effort. By the end of the first month, he had told his wife 3 stories from their early years together that he had not thought about in so long that she had assumed he had forgotten them entirely. She cried. He told me that was the moment he stopped managing this quietly and told her everything. This is what BDNF restoration looks like in a real life, in a real body. In the ordinary Tuesday mornings and family dinners and Bible reading chairs of a person who had been created for clarity and was simply living below it until the interference was removed. And Harold is not an exception. He is a preview. Now, let me give you a framework that you can use starting today, regardless of where you are in the process, to actively support the architecture of your memory as it is being restored. I am going to call this the Memory Architecture Reset, and it has 3 distinct layers of practice, each one corresponding to one of the 3 memory layers we discussed earlier: personal, generational, and sacred. The first layer of the reset is for your personal memory, and it is the simplest. It is the practice of narration. When you move through your day, especially through transitions, leaving one room, finishing one task and beginning another, moving from one conversation to the next, briefly narrate to yourself, in your own internal voice, what you are doing and why. Not as a memory trick, not as a compensation strategy, as a practice of presence. The brain encodes more deeply what the mind is fully present for, and narration is the fastest way to bring the wandering mind back into full presence with the body it is traveling in. This is not about talking to yourself. It is about being genuinely with yourself as you move through your own life. The second layer is for your generational memory, and it requires something slightly different. I want you to think of one story, just one, from the history that you carry. A story that has not been told recently. A story that belongs to someone who is no longer here to tell it. And I want you to do something with it. Not in this moment, but in the next conversation you have with someone who needs to hear it. Tell it. Not because it is polished or complete, not because you are certain of every detail, but because the practice of telling is also the practice of reinforcing, and every time the generational story is told out loud, its roots go a little deeper in the memory that holds it. The story that is told lives longer than the story that is kept. During your 17-minute morning activation, as your BDNF levels are rising and your neural pathways are in their most receptive state, there is a specific kind of mental practice that amplifies the generational layers restoration. Simply hold the story you have been carrying in your awareness, not analyzing it, not trying to add detail to it, just holding it the same way you would hold a photograph and let its meaning reach you without effort. The brain, in a BDNF active state, does something remarkable with this kind of relaxed, receptive attention. It begins to surface detail that was not accessible before, not always, not on a schedule, but often enough that the practice is worth doing. The third layer of the reset is for your sacred memory, and this is the one I want you to pay the most careful attention to, because it is the layer most directly connected to the assignment you carry and the reason God arranged for this restoration in this specific season of your life. The practice for the sacred layer is return, not to a feeling, not to an emotional state you are trying to recreate. Return to a moment, a specific, dated, located moment in your history when God showed up in a way that left no room for alternative explanation. A moment whose weight you still feel when you let yourself remember it, even if the memory has thinned somewhat around the edges. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 21 says, "Do not let wisdom and understanding out of your sight." And the Hebrew natsar, "do not let it slip away unnoticed," is precisely the opposite practice from what I am describing. The practice I am describing is the active, intentional retrieval and re-engagement with the sacred encounters that form the foundation of your faith and your testimony. This is not nostalgia. This is maintenance of the most important archive you carry. Once a day, or once a week at minimum, deliberately return to one of those moments. Let it be fully present in your mind. Trace the details that are still there. And then, in the space where details have thinned, simply tell God what you remember and ask Him to keep it. He will. He has been keeping it all along. The memory architecture reset works because it works with the same structure that God built into the mind to preserve what matters most. And as the 17-minute morning activation continues to do its work, as BDNF production rises back toward the level He designed it to reach, the three layers of practice become easier, faster, more natural, until the day comes, and it does come, when the reset is no longer a practice you are applying deliberately. It is simply how your mind works again. Now, I need to show you something that nobody in the church talks about openly, and when I tell you what it is, you may feel some resistance to it, because it challenges something that most faithful people have been taught to think of as purely a spiritual matter, with no biological component whatsoever. It has everything to do with why some prayers feel like they land directly in the throne room of heaven, and others feel like they dissolve into the ceiling of the room you are sitting in. And the answer to that question is not what you think it is. The reason some prayers land and others don't has almost nothing to do with what most people assume it has to do with. Most people, when they notice the inconsistency, reach for the same explanations. They were not focused enough. They were carrying unconfessed sin. Their faith was thin that day. The timing was not right. They were asking for the wrong thing. And all of those explanations have some validity somewhere in the landscape of prayer, but none of them account for what I believe is the most overlooked variable in the entire conversation about communion with God: the state of the mind receiving the communication. Think about what a radio does. The signal being broadcast from the tower does not change based on the quality of the radio picking it up. The broadcast is constant, full strength, uninterrupted. What changes is the receiver. A receiver tuned to the right frequency, with its circuitry functioning as designed, picks up the signal clearly and delivers it with full fidelity. A receiver that is damaged or poorly tuned, or operating with degraded components, picks up something: fragments, interference, a signal that is recognizable but incomplete, a message that arrives garbled enough that the listener is not entirely sure what they heard. God's signal does not fluctuate, your receiver does. And the receiver is not your spirit. Your spirit, in the language of Scripture, is the deepest and most enduring part of you, the part that was breathed into you directly by God and that cannot be permanently damaged by the interference of the world. But your spirit communicates to your conscious mind through the architecture of your brain. And that architecture, the neural pathways, the memory layers, the BDNF sustained structures through which divine impressions travel on their way from your spirit to your awareness, that architecture is subject to the same interference that we have been describing throughout this entire message. This is the connection that the church has not yet fully made. Not because the truth is hidden, it is right there in the text, in Paul's language about the renewing of the mind, in Daniel's God-given understanding, in Solomon's prayer, not just for wisdom, but for a discerning heart, the kind of heart that could receive wisdom and hold it clearly enough to act on it. The connection between spiritual receptivity and neurological condition is woven through the entire Scripture. It has simply been read as metaphor when it was meant as mechanism. Here is what this means practically, and here is why it matters for your assignment specifically. The enemy of your soul is not unintelligent. Whatever you believe about the nature and the methods of the spiritual opposition that Scripture describes, one thing is consistently clear across the entire biblical narrative. The attack on God's chosen ones is rarely frontal. It is rarely obvious. It rarely announces itself as what it is. It comes as circumstance. It comes as culture. It comes as the slow accumulation of things that seem unrelated to each other: a busier schedule, a worse diet, a later bedtime, a quieter devotional life that individually would not constitute an attack, but that together, over time, produce a result that serves the enemy's purposes with remarkable precision. The result is a chosen one whose receiver is turned down, a person whose assignment from God is still burning in their spirit, but whose mind no longer has the neural clarity to receive it with the precision it requires, who prays and hears something, but not as clearly as before, who reads the word and is fed by it, but not as deeply as before, who carries wisdom accumulated over decades, but finds it arriving to the surface more slowly, less completely, less usefully than the moment demands. This is not an accident. It is a strategy, because a chosen one who is operating at half clarity is not disabled. They are still praying. They are still serving. They are still present. But they are running the most important work of their life on a receiver that is significantly below its designed capacity. And the assignments that require full clarity, the words of knowledge, the prophetic impressions, the precise discernment that separates the voice of God from the voice of anxiety, the ability to receive a specific instruction and carry it faithfully from morning to evening without it dissolving in the fog. Those assignments are being carried imperfectly by a mind that was created to carry them with precision. In 2 Timothy chapter 1 verse 7, when Paul writes that God gave us a sound mind, the Greek word is sophronismos, and we have talked about this before. But I want to return to it from a different angle now. Sophronismos does not describe a mind that is functioning adequately. It describes a mind operating at its full designed capacity for discernment, for clarity, for the precise kind of self-governance that makes it possible to take a divine impression and act on it correctly without distorting it through fear or confusion or fog. That is the mind God says He gave you. That is the receiver He designed for the frequency at which He speaks. And when the enemy cannot take the signal away from you, and he cannot, because God does not revoke His gifts, He does the next best thing. He degrades the receiver. Slowly, systematically, through 5 forces that are all culturally normal, medically unremarkable, and entirely overlooked as a coordinated attack on the most important piece of spiritual equipment you carry. This is the root of what has been happening. Not aging, not spiritual failure, not unfaithfulness. A deliberate and patient strategy aimed at the mind of every chosen one who carries something significant enough to be worth disrupting. And understanding this changes everything about how you respond. Because a person who thinks they are aging makes peace with it as best they can. But a person who understands they are under attack does something entirely different. They fight back. And here is how. I want to give you a framework that I call the Neural Activation Prayer Method, and it is built on a single foundational insight. The quality of what you receive in prayer is directly related to the neural state in which you enter prayer. And the neural state that produces the clearest, deepest, most precisely receptive experience of communion with God is also, as it turns out, the neural state that BDNF most actively supports. This is not mysticism. This is the mechanism God built into the relationship between mind and spirit from the beginning. The Neural Activation Prayer Method has 3 distinct phases, and it changes not just how clearly you hear God, but how fully you can hold and act on what you hear. The first phase is preparation. Before you open Scripture, before you speak the first word of prayer, spend the first few minutes of your quiet time in a specific kind of internal stillness that I am going to describe precisely, because the way most people begin their devotional time actually works against the receptivity they are trying to create. Most people begin with words, either spoken words or written words, or the words of a devotional. They are reading something that immediately engages the language processing centers of the brain in the mode of analysis, of interpretation, of active thought. And none of that is wrong. But it begins with the parts of the brain that are most associated with the waking, effortful, evaluative mind, and it often stays there in that register for the entire devotional time. The preparation phase asks you to begin differently. Before the first word, become aware of your breathing for 60 seconds, not controlling it, not deepening it, not performing a technique. Simply noticing it, the way you would notice the weather through a window present to it, without effort. What this does, in 60 seconds, is begin to shift the brain from the effortful, analytical register into the relaxed but alert register that neuroscience has identified as the state most associated with insight, integration, and deep pattern recognition. It is the state in which the parts of the brain that process meaning, not just information, but meaning, become most active and most available. It is also, not coincidentally, the state most associated with BDNF activation. The second phase is reception. This is the heart of the method, and it is simpler than it sounds. Once you have entered the preparation state, begin to read slowly, not for quantity, not to cover a chapter or complete a reading plan, but to meet what is on the page. Read until something lifts. Not until something makes intellectual sense. Until something lifts. Until a word or a phrase or an image has a quality to it that is different from the surrounding text. A quality of being addressed rather than observed. When that happens, stop. Do not analyze it immediately. Do not reach for what it might mean or how it applies or what you should do with it. Simply let it be present in your mind, the way a stone sits in still water, fully there, taking up space, resting on the floor of your awareness. The sacred memory layer, when BDNF is actively supporting it, will begin to draw connections in this space of unhurried reception that the analytical, effortful mind is too busy to find. Insights that feel like sudden arrivals are almost always the product of a prior period of receptive stillness that the conscious mind was not aware of, processing what had been given to it. This is the fine silence from 1 Kings chapter 19, not the absence of sound, the presence of a quality of attention so complete that a whisper is enough. The third phase is declaration. After the period of reception, speak, not silently out loud, even quietly, even in a whisper, if the house is full and privacy is limited. Speaking what you have received in the phase of reception does something that silent acknowledgement does not. It engages the motor cortex, the auditory processing centers, and the language centers simultaneously. And the combination of those three systems activating together around the same content creates a neural encoding that is significantly more durable than silent thought alone. What you speak out loud in this phase, you are far more likely to be able to access at 10 o'clock that evening than what you merely thought in the silence of your mind. The prophets spoke, not only in the gathered assembly, but in their private communion with God. They declared what they had received. They gave voice to what had been given to them in stillness. This was not performance. This was the instinctive understanding of how the mind works, applied to the most important content the mind ever receives. As your BDNF levels are elevated each morning through the 17-minute activation practice, what you encounter in this third phase, the declaration phase, will carry an authority and a clarity that surprises you, because you are not speaking from a receiver that is degraded and struggling. You are speaking from a receiver that is operating closer to the design God built into it, and the difference in the quality of what comes through is something you will notice immediately, even in the first week. I want you to try something right now, in this moment, as a way of anchoring what we have been discussing into something real rather than something abstract. In your mind, without speaking it out loud, bring to the surface one word or one phrase that God has spoken to you before, something from a previous season, something that came to you in prayer or in scripture or in one of those moments of inexplicable clarity that left you with a certainty that outlasted your ability to explain it. Just one. The first one that surfaces. Hold it for a moment. Notice how clearly or how faintly it arrives. Notice whether it comes with the full weight it had when it was first given, or whether it has thinned somewhat around the edges, the way a photograph thins with time still recognizable, but less vivid than the original. That degree of vividness, or thinning, is information. It is telling you something about the current state of your sacred memory layer, and it is telling you something about what is possible as that layer is restored. Because the word God spoke to you did not change, the weight he put in it did not diminish. What changed was the receiver's ability to access it with full fidelity. and what is being reclaimed through the 5 anchors, through the memory architecture reset, through the neural activation prayer method, and through the 17-minute morning practice that underlies all of them, is precisely that fidelity. The ability to hold what was given to you with the same clarity it arrived with. The ability to pass it forward with the same authority it carried when it first landed. If that word just came back to you with any measure of clarity, comment "clear" below, because heaven has been keeping it for you, and the restoration of your ability to receive it fully is already in motion. Now, I want to bring you to a place of summary, and I want to do it carefully because there is something important I need you to notice about where we are in this conversation. You now understand the problem at its root. You know what BDNF is and why it was designed to be there. You know the 5 forces that have been systematically draining it. You know the 3 layers of memory and which layer matters most for the assignment you carry. You have the memory architecture reset. You have the 5 daily anchors. You have the neural activation prayer method. And you have access to the 17-minute morning activation practice that sits underneath all of them and supports each one with the neural conditions they require to work at their full capacity. If you applied everything in this message consistently, starting tomorrow morning, you would be giving your brain more of what God designed it to receive and less of what the enemy has been using to degrade it. And the research is clear that the results of that combination begin to show up within days, not weeks. The personal memory layer sharpens first, then the generational layer, then the sacred layer, returning with a vividness that is, for many people, the most moving part of the entire process, the morning when the scripture comes alive again, the morning when the prayer stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like conversation. You have everything you need. And that is exactly where I need to stop and tell you something, because I just described a complete picture, a full framework, a beginning and a middle, and what sounds like an end. And that is the nature of a false summit, and you are standing on one right now, and I want to name it before you begin descending from it, thinking the mountain is behind you. What I have given you is the biology and the practice, the science of what was lost and how to restore it, the daily framework for rebuilding what the interference dismantled. And all of it is real. All of it is true. All of it will make a measurable difference in your life and in the lives of the people who depend on you to carry the stories and the testimony that you carry. But there is a dimension of what is happening to your mind that we have not yet touched. A dimension that is not biological and not practical and cannot be addressed by any framework, however well designed. A dimension that changes the entire question we have been asking. Because here is what I have not told you yet, and what you will not find in any of the research, and what no wellness program and no supplement protocol and no morning practice will ever be able to give you on its own. The restoration of your memory is not the end goal. It is the beginning of one. And what that goal is, and why the enemy has been so invested in preventing you from reaching it, is something that sits at the heart of why God arranged for this specific message to find you in this specific season of your life. What you are about to hear is not about your memory at all. It is about what your memory is for. What your memory is for. That is the question that changes everything. Not what your memory is, not how it works, not even how to restore it. What it is for. Because here is what I have been leading you toward this entire time, and what I need you to hear now with your full attention, because this is the turn in the road that most messages never reach. You have been thinking about your memory as yours, and it is yours. Of course it is. The names and the dates and the stories and the prayers and the sacred encounters, all of it lives inside you. and you are the one who carries it, and the loss of it is personal. In the most intimate way, a loss can be personal, but your memory is not only yours. Let me show you what I mean by that. There is a woman in your family's future. She has not been born yet, or she is young enough that she does not yet know the questions she will one day need answered. And on a day that has not arrived yet, a day when the ground beneath her shifts in the particular way that the ground shifts for every person at some point in their life, when the thing she built her confidence on turns out not to hold her weight, when the story she was told about herself stops being enough to stand on that day, she is going to need something. Not a self-help framework, not a motivational quote, a testimony, a real one, specific, anchored in actual events, in actual years, in a God who showed up in a particular place, at a particular time, for a particular person whose blood runs in her veins. A testimony that does not say God is faithful in general, but says he was faithful here, in this circumstance, when the odds said otherwise, and here is exactly what happened. That testimony lives in you. And this is the thing the enemy has understood about your generation, that your generation has not yet fully understood about itself. You are not just a collection of individuals who happen to be experiencing memory challenges at roughly the same stage of life. You are the archive generation. You are the ones who hold, in your personal and generational and sacred memory, the living proof of what God has done across decades that the next generation has not witnessed and cannot access by any other means. When your memory thins, the proof thins with it. When the stories arrive incomplete, the testimony arrives incomplete. When the sacred encounters become harder to recall with precision, the inheritance you were designed to pass forward becomes thinner, vaguer, more like a general belief in a distant God, and less like the first-hand account of a God who shows up specifically, personally, with a precision that leaves no room for coincidence. And a generation that inherits belief without testimony is a generation that is one hard season away from losing the belief entirely. This is what is at stake, not your comfort, not your quality of life at the dinner table, as real and as important as that is. What is at stake is the inheritance of people who are not yet old enough to know they will need what you carry. In 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5, Paul writes to Timothy not about Timothy's own faith, but about the faith of his grandmother Lois and his mother Eunice, and how that faith, which he says was genuine in them, now lives in Timothy. Paul is describing a transmission, a specific, personal, witness transmission of faith that went from grandmother to mother to son, carried not as a set of theological propositions, but as a lived and witnessed reality that Timothy could point to and say, I know this is true because I watched it be true in the people who came before me. That is what generational memory carries. That is what is being attacked. And it is no accident that the attack intensifies precisely in the generation that holds the most evidence. Now, I want to give you a framework for understanding your role in this transmission and for actively positioning yourself as the keeper of the inheritance your family needs from you. I am going to call this the generational legacy framework, and it has 3 movements, each one corresponding to a different kind of action you can take right now, regardless of where your memory currently is in its restoration. The first movement is called the inventory. This is the practice of deliberately identifying what you carry that nobody else in your family can carry. Not the general stories everybody in the family knows, the broad outline of things. I am talking about the specific, textured, first-person accounts of divine encounter that only you were present for. The prayer that was answered before you finished praying it. The door that closed and the door that opened in the same week. And how you knew in real time that it was God and not coincidence. The moment when the scripture you had read 100 times suddenly had a specific word in it that was addressed precisely to your situation and what happened because you responded to it. These are not small things. They are the materials of a testimony that can hold the next generation steady in a season you will not be alive to see. During your 17-minute morning activation, as your BDNF levels rise and your neural pathways are in their most receptive and integrative state, I want you to hold this inventory practice gently in your awareness. Not straining to remember, simply remaining open to what surfaces. The brain in a BDNF active state does something remarkable when it is given permission to wander through the sacred layer without pressure. It surfaces things that were not accessible under the effortful trying that most people use when they attempt deliberate memory recall. Let the inventory happen in the receptive state rather than the effortful one, and you will find that more arrives than you expected. The second movement of the generational legacy framework is called the telling, not the perfecting, the telling. This is where I want to name something that many people in this generation have been doing quietly without realizing the cost of it. They have been waiting to tell certain stories until they can tell them completely, until the details are all there, until they are sure they have it right. And in the waiting, the stories have been staying inside, untold, growing slightly thinner each season, while the people who need to hear them are growing older in the meantime, without the inheritance those stories carry. Tell the story now, in whatever condition it is in. The pieces that are fully there, tell those. The pieces where the detail has thinned, tell what remains. And for the pieces that are genuinely gone, be honest about that, because honesty about the limits of memory is not weakness. It is the kind of transparency that makes a testimony credible rather than performed. Your grandchild does not need a perfectly recalled and polished account. They need to sit across from someone who was there, and to feel in their own body the weight of what it meant, and to hear in your voice something that no second-hand account can carry. The specific quality of wonder that only comes from someone who was in the room when it happened. That quality does not require a perfect memory. It requires a willing one. The third movement is called the commission, and this is the most important of the three because it is the one that ensures the transmission continues beyond you. After you tell the story, ask the person you told it to tell it back to you, not as a test, as a ritual of passing. Let them hold it in their own voice, even imperfectly, even with details that are slightly different from the way you told it, because the act of retelling in their own voice is the act of taking ownership of the inheritance. It moves the story from something they received to something they carry. The pattern is in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 6 and 7, where God gives not just the commandment to hold these words in your own heart, but the explicit instruction to impress them on your children, talking about them when you sit at home, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, and when you get up. The transmission was never meant to be a single formal event. It was meant to be woven into the texture of daily life, repeated in different contexts until the next generation knew it, as well as the generation that first received it. You are the generation that received it directly. The commission is yours. Now I need to take you somewhere uncomfortable, and I want to do it with the same care that I have tried to bring to everything in this message, because what I am about to ask you to look at is something most people in this position have never been directly invited to examine. Knowing what is at stake, knowing that the stories and the testimonies and the sacred encounters you carry are not just personal memories, but the inherited evidence of God's faithfulness for the people who come after you. How does that land on the part of you that has been watching the memory thin? Let me be more specific. There is a version of this conversation that ends with a person feeling inspired and motivated and clear about their purpose, and they carry that clarity for a few days, and then life returns to its ordinary pace, and the weight of what was said settles into the background, like most things eventually do. And then there is the version where the weight of what was said does not settle, where it stays present at the front of the awareness, because the person allowed it to find the place in them where it was actually true, not inspirationally true, not theologically true in the abstract sense, but personally, specifically, urgently true in the way that something is true when it has your name on it. I want to invite you into the second version, because there is a specific grief that belongs to this moment, and it will not serve you to move past it too quickly. It is the grief of realizing that the thinning you have been managing privately, the gaps in the stories, the names that arrive slowly, the sacred encounters that have become slightly blurry around the edges, that thinning has not only been affecting you, it has been affecting the transmission. It has been quietly thinning the inheritance before it reaches the people it was designed for. And the part of you that is a parent, or a grandparent, or a keeper of the family story, that part knows this. It has known it, in some corner of its awareness, for longer than you have been willing to fully acknowledge it. There are moments that bring this into focus. A grandchild who asks about great-grandparents you barely remember, and you watch the thinness of what you have to give them pass across their face as something they cannot name, but feel. A conversation at a family gathering where a story is being told incorrectly, and you know it is incorrect, but you cannot summon the correction with enough confidence to offer it. A night when you lie awake and the thought arrives, quiet and specific and relentless, that what you are leaving behind is less than what you were given, and the chain of transmission that was supposed to run unbroken through you is carrying less than it should be. Let that thought be present for a moment. Not to stay in it, but to honor it with the full weight of honesty it deserves. Because a person who has honestly reckoned with the cost of the thinning is a person who is ready to do something about it with a seriousness that inspiration alone cannot sustain. Psalm 71, at its deepest level, is the prayer of a person who has fully reckoned with what it would mean to lose the capacity to finish the assignment. Verse 18, and this is the verse that usually gets left out of the quote, says, "Even when I am old and grey, do not forsake me, O God, until I declare your power to the next generation, your mighty acts to all who are to come." The prayer is not simply, "Do not let me decline." The prayer is, "Do not let me decline before I have finished the transmission. Hold me together long enough for me to complete the passing on." That is a specific prayer, it has a specific object, and it deserves a specific, honest answer about where the transmission currently is and what it would take to complete it. If that prayer is yours today, let it be yours honestly. Comment below the word transmit, not as a performance, but as a declaration. This is what I am reclaiming my memory for, not just for myself, for what comes after me. Now, I want to name the enemy's strategy with a precision that I believe you are ready to hear, because you have walked far enough into this message to hold what I am about to say without it being merely theoretical. The attack on your memory is not random. It is not the undifferentiated effect of modern life landing on everyone equally. It is a coordinated strategy that takes specific forms, and those forms are worth naming individually, because when you can recognize a form of attack for what it is, it loses much of its power to operate in the dark. The first form is what I call the information flood. This is the force that begins before your eyes are fully open in the morning, when the habit of reaching for news and notifications in the first minutes of waking floods your system with cortisol before it has had time to establish its own baseline for the day. The way this attack works is not dramatic. It does not announce itself as an attack on your memory. It presents as staying informed, as being responsible, as keeping up with what is happening in the world. But what it is actually doing is setting the neurochemical tone for your entire day at the highest possible stress level before a single decision of consequence has been made, and it does so every morning with the consistency of a deliberate protocol. You recognize it when you notice that the 10 minutes after you put the phone down feel different from the 10 minutes before you picked it up. When what arrived on the screen came with a weight that follows you into the kitchen, into the first conversation of the day, into the chair where you intended to spend time with God. When the mind that was meant to receive the fine silence is already full of noise before the day has properly started. The way to win against this form is deceptively simple. Protect a window of 30 minutes between waking and first exposure to any external information source. Not because the information is irrelevant, it may be entirely relevant, but because the receiver that you need to function at full capacity for the rest of the day requires a specific kind of quiet during its calibration. Period. The prophets knew this. They sought God in the morning, before the day was built, before the demands of the world had a chance to crowd the fine silence into a corner. Your 30-minute morning window is not a luxury. It is maintenance of the most important equipment you carry. The second form of attack is what I will call the sugar silencing, and this is the form that is perhaps most difficult to name as an attack, because it arrives wearing the costume of pleasure and comfort and the ordinary rhythms of a shared meal. The mechanism is this: when blood sugar rises rapidly from refined carbohydrates and added sugars, and then crashes in the way that rapid rises are always followed by rapid falls, the brain experiences that crash as a mild but real state of emergency. The resources it was using for memory consolidation, for the higher order processing that keeps your 3 memory layers functioning at capacity, are temporarily redirected toward managing the blood sugar crisis. This happens multiple times a day for most people in modern culture. Each individual incident is small. The cumulative effect, over months and years, is not small at all. You recognize this form when you notice that a particular time of day, usually mid-afternoon, usually an hour or two after a meal, is consistently your foggiest and most unreliable for memory and clear thinking. When the sharpness that was present in the morning has softened into something that feels like trying to think through gauze. When the stories that were accessible 3 hours ago are a little harder to reach. The way to win against this form is to reduce the amplitude of the blood sugar swings, not by eliminating pleasure from food, but by slowing the rise protein and fat alongside the carbohydrate, fiber before the sweet, a smaller portion of the thing that spikes rather than none of it. The brain that is not managing a blood sugar crisis is a brain with its full resources available for what matters most. The third form is the one I want to spend a little more time on, because it is the form that is most specifically targeted at the sacred layer of your memory, and it is the form that operates most quietly, because it does not feel like an attack at all. It feels like a reasonable adjustment. It looks like this: a season becomes busy. The demands of life are real, and the hours in the day are finite. And the morning practice that was once an hour becomes 40 minutes, and then 30, and then 20, and then a quick reading before the day gets too far ahead of you. And then, some mornings, it just doesn't happen because there is too much already waiting. And nothing dramatic occurs. The faith does not collapse. The prayer does not stop entirely. The belief remains. But the sacred layer of memory, the layer that is most actively maintained by precisely the kind of extended, receptive, unhurried engagement with God that the morning practice provides, begins to receive less of the maintenance it was designed to receive. And the sacred encounters that were once vivid and accessible begin to recede toward the background, not dramatically, but in the same way that a room gets darker, not when the light is switched off, but when the dimmer is turned very slowly. So slowly that you do not notice the change until you realize you cannot read what you used to be able to read. Isaiah chapter 46 verse 4 uses a word that is worth sitting with in this context. When God says, "I am he who will sustain you," the Hebrew word is sabal, and sabal does not mean to sustain in the sense of passive maintenance, of keeping something from falling below a minimum threshold. It means to bear up under a weight, to carry something actively through territory that would otherwise crush it. God was not promising to maintain the sacred memory layer at a survival level. He was promising to actively carry it through the seasons in which the conditions were working against it. But Sabal operates in partnership. The vessel that God carries must remain in the relationship that makes the carrying possible. The morning practice is not earning God's favor. It is keeping the channel open through which the carrying flows. The way to win against the third form of attack is not to add more to your schedule. It is to treat the morning practice as the one appointment in your day that cannot be moved. For the same reason that no urgent circumstance would lead you to cancel the maintenance of your heart medication, because what is at stake is not discretionary. There are 4 more forms of this attack that we are going to name and address, and when you have seen all 7, the picture of what has been happening to your generation will be complete, and the fury of the chosen one, who understands what has been done to them, is a very different kind of fuel than the anxiety of the person who simply knew something was wrong but could not name it. That fury, rightly directed, is the energy the next part of this message is going to give you somewhere to put. That fury is this: when you know what has been taken from you, and why, and by what specific means, the response that arises is not despair, it is not helplessness. It is the particular kind of anger that belongs to a person who finally sees the shape of something that was operating in the dark, and who understands that seeing it clearly is the first act of defeating it. So let us finish naming it. The 4th form of attack is what I call the comparison drain, and this one is specific to the way social information now moves through the lives of people in this generation in a way that was not true for the generation before you. It looks like this: you pick up the phone, or you sit down at a computer, or you pass through a room where a screen is on, and in the space of a few minutes you have received more information about how other people are living, what they have accomplished, what their families look like from the outside, what milestones they are celebrating, than any previous generation in human history would have received in a year of ordinary life. And your brain, which was designed to process social comparison in the context of a small and local community, receives this volume of comparative information and responds the way any system responds when it is given inputs at a scale it was not built for. It generates a low-grade, persistent state of inadequacy. Not dramatic inadequacy, not a crisis of self-worth you would notice and name, just a steady background hum of not quite enough that runs underneath everything else, the sense that what you have and what you are and what you have accomplished sits slightly below the waterline of what it apparently should be, based on the curated evidence currently in front of you. And that steady hum costs something. It costs the brain a continuous expenditure of cortisol and the resulting BDNF suppression that accompanies every sustained cortisol state. It costs the sacred layer specifically, because the sacred layer requires a quality of inner stillness to remain vivid and accessible, and a mind running a background program of social comparison is never fully still. You recognize this form when you notice that you feel slightly diminished after certain kinds of media consumption in a way that you cannot precisely name, but that leaves you with less energy for prayer, less appetite for scripture, and a slightly flattened quality in your access to the sacred encounters that are normally the most living part of your memory. The way to win against this form is not to withdraw from the world or to avoid all information about other people's lives. It is to build the practice of what I would call a sacred reset, a deliberate, brief return to one specific moment of divine encounter in your own history, immediately following any significant consumption of comparative content. Not as a spiritual discipline performed with gritted teeth, but as an act of re-anchoring the identity to the reality that actually defines it. When the comparison drain has briefly pulled you away from who you are, the sacred reset reminds you of the evidence you actually have, and the evidence you actually have is considerably more substantial than a curated feed of someone else's highlights. The fifth form is the isolation creep, and this form is the one that research has identified as perhaps the most biologically significant of all the BDNF suppressors, and it is the one that arrives most gradually and departs most slowly once it has taken hold. It happens in stages. First, there is the natural narrowing of the social circle that comes with life transitions, children growing and moving away, colleagues retiring, the slow attrition of friendships that were sustained by shared circumstances that no longer exist. Then there is the adjustment to a quieter life that is not wrong in itself, but that can, if it continues, without conscious attention, shade from peaceful solitude into something that begins to feel more like disappearance. And then there is the particular kind of isolation that comes not from being physically alone, but from feeling unheard in company, from being present in a room full of people and feeling that what you carry, the depth of what you have lived and learned and witnessed, does not have a natural place in the conversations that are happening around you. That last form of isolation is the one I want to name specifically, because it is both the most painful and the most common for chosen ones in this generation. You recognize it at the family table, when the conversation moves through topics that have nothing to do with anything you know deeply, and you sit with decades of experience and testimony that there is no natural opening to contribute. You recognize it in a culture that increasingly treats age as a diminishment rather than an accumulation, and in the subtle ways that message has been absorbed, even by the people who love you and would be horrified to know they were transmitting it. You recognize it in the growing habit of not beginning certain sentences because you have learned, gradually and without deciding to, that there is not always a place for them to land. The way to win against this form is to build deliberate structures of genuine connection that are not dependent on the natural social openings the current culture provides. A regular, real conversation, not a group text, not a comment on a post, but a voice or a face, and a willingness to go somewhere real with at least one person who holds the same weight of years and experience that you hold. The brain that is regularly engaged in genuine, deep, reciprocal human connection is a brain that is receiving one of the most powerful natural BDNF stimulants that exists, and there is no frequency, no supplement, and no morning practice that fully substitutes for what that kind of connection does to the architecture of the mind. As your BDNF levels rise each morning through the 17-minute activation ritual, you will find that the desire and the capacity for this kind of genuine connection also rises. Because the brain that is operating at its designed capacity has more to bring to relationship and more appetite to receive from it, and the isolation that felt natural at a lower BDNF level begins to feel less like a preference and more like a condition that can be changed. The sixth form is the identity erosion. And this is the form that is most directly connected to the sacred layer of your memory, because it operates through the slow dismantling of your sense of who you are in relation to God and to the assignment He has placed on your life. It does not arrive as a theological crisis. It arrives as a quiet withdrawal of the inner certainty that once made certain things feel unmistakably true. The sense that you are specifically known by God, that your life has a specific shape that is not accidental, that the encounters and the testimonies and the sacred moments you carry are evidence of a particular relationship that has your name on it. That sense can thin, in the same way that BDNF thins, gradually, without a single dramatic event you could point to. And as it thins, the stories that depended on it for their authority begin to thin as well. The testimony that was told with the conviction of a witness becomes something told with the slightly apologetic qualifier of someone who is no longer entirely sure what they saw. The sacred encounters that were once recounted as fact become presented as personal experience, which is true, but which quietly relocates them from the category of evidence to the category of opinion. You recognize this form when the phrases you used to say about God and about your relationship with Him have become slightly more hedged than they were, when the certainty that once felt like ground has become something more like a position you are defending rather than a foundation you are standing on. In Deuteronomy chapter 8 verse 2, God instructs Israel to remember the entire journey. He had led them through every provision, every intervention, every miraculous turn of circumstance in the wilderness, and the reason He gives is striking. He says, "Remember, so that you know what was in your heart." The remembering was not only for God's benefit, it was so that Israel would know themselves, so that the people would understand who they were by seeing clearly what God had done in and through and for them over time. The sacred memory was the identity. Without it, who were they? A group of people in a desert, that was all. With it, they were a people with a history and a God and a destination and a calling. Your sacred memory is your identity the same way. Not your feelings about your identity, not your sense of your identity, but the actual, evidential, historical record of who you have been in relationship with God. When that record thins, the identity thins with it. And the way to win against this form is to engage in the deliberate and regular practice of remembering the sacred reset, the generational inventory, the declaration phase of the neural activation prayer method, not as religious duty, but as the active maintenance of the identity that God has been building in you across your entire life. The seventh form is the one that ties all the others together, and it is the only one that is not, at its root, biological. The first six forms all operate through the BDNF suppression pathway. They all work by reducing the memory protein that God placed in you and allowing the three memory layers to thin as a consequence. But the seventh form operates differently. The seventh form is what I call the narrative replacement, and it works like this. When the memory thins and the identity that depended on the sacred layer begins to waver, there is a vacuum, and into that vacuum a different narrative begins to fill, not dramatically, not in a single moment of theological crisis, but gradually, word by word, in the way that any story gets rewritten when the people who know the true version stop being available to correct it. The narrative replacement says, what you thought was a calling was a season that has now passed. What you thought was a specific assignment was perhaps a general aspiration. What you thought was evidence of God's particular attention to your particular life was maybe just coincidence and wishful thinking and the human tendency to find patterns in random events. And the worst thing about the narrative replacement is that it does not feel like the enemy talking. It feels like maturity. like the reasonable adult perspective on the enthusiasms of an earlier season, like the honest acknowledgement of what can and cannot be known for certain, and it is none of those things. It is the most sophisticated form of the attack on your memory, because it does not take the testimony away from you. It simply reinterprets it until the testimony no longer functions as testimony. Romans chapter 12, verse 2. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. The word conformed in the Greek is syschematizo, and it means to be pressed into the shape of something by external force, gradually, until the original form is lost and the new shape feels natural. The narrative replacement is syschematizo. It is the slow pressing of your story into the shape of a world that has no category for what you actually experienced until the story begins to present itself in terms the world can accommodate. The way to win against this form is the one practice that all of the previous 6 forms were trying to prevent you from sustaining: the consistent, specific, repeated telling of what you actually witnessed, in the actual terms in which it happened, to people who need to hear it told that way, not the apologetic version, not the hedged version. The version that says, this is what happened, and this is what God did, and I was there, and I know what I saw. That telling is the antidote to the narrative replacement, and every time it is spoken, the testimony is reinforced against the reinterpretation that is trying to quietly dissolve it. You have just been given the names of all 7 forms of the attack that has been operating against your memory and your testimony and your identity as a keeper of sacred inheritance. 7 specific, nameable, recognizable forces. And now I want to give you something that sits underneath all of them, that connects them at the deepest level, and that makes sense of why the attack has taken these 7 specific forms rather than any of 1,000 other forms it could have taken. In your mind right now, without moving, let this question arrive and let it find a real answer rather than a quick one. Who are you, apart from what you remember? Not who you are according to your relationships, your history, your accomplishments, your beliefs. Who are you if the memory of those things is removed? If you sat for a moment with that question and felt the ground shift slightly beneath your thinking, you encountered something that the enemy of your soul has understood about you from the beginning. Your identity is not separate from your memory. It is built from your memory. The person you know yourself to be exists as a coherent, continuous, recognizable self, precisely because the memories that form that self are accessible, connected, and available to be brought into the present. When memory thins, identity thins, not all at once, not dramatically, but in the specific way that a building thins when the foundation underneath it begins to settle slowly, with small cracks in unexpected places, until the day comes when something that seemed stable is no longer quite where it was. The attack on your memory was never really about your memory. It was about your identity. Because a chosen one who is uncertain of their own identity cannot speak with the authority of their testimony, cannot pass forward the inheritance with the weight it deserves, cannot stand in the specific place of calling that was designed for them, because they are no longer entirely certain what that place is or whether they deserve to occupy it. In Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5, God says to the prophet, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart." The Hebrew word for "knew" is yada, and yada is not the word for intellectual knowledge. It is the word for the deepest, most intimate kind of knowing, the kind that comes from being in relationship with something over time and understanding its specific nature and its specific potential and its specific role in a larger story. God did not know about Jeremiah in the way you know about a historical figure. He knew Jeremiah the way you know someone whose face and voice and particular way of being in the world has become so familiar that you recognize them from a distance, in a crowd, by something that has nothing to do with appearance alone. That is the knowing that God had of Jeremiah before a single day of his life had occurred, and that knowing is the knowing God has of you. Your identity was not constructed from your memory. It was established before your memory began. The memory is evidence of the identity, not the source of it. And that means that when the memory thins, the identity that God established does not thin with it. What thins is your access to the evidence of the identity that was always already there. This is the distinction that changes everything about how you approach the restoration. You are not rebuilding something that was lost. You are clearing the interference from something that was never diminished. I want to tell you about a woman I will call Margaret. She was 63 years old when her daughter first noticed something had changed, and 64 by the time Margaret herself was willing to acknowledge what she had been noticing privately for longer than that. She had been a Sunday school teacher for 31 years. She knew her Bible with the kind of familiarity that comes not from study alone, but from years of living inside the text, letting it be the interpretive framework through which everything else is understood. She could quote from memory, cross-reference from instinct, and find the exact verse she needed in the middle of a conversation without looking it up. And then, over the course of about 2 years, the fluency began to slow. Not disappear, slow. The verses that used to arrive whole began to arrive in pieces. The cross-references that used to come immediately began to require effort. And one Sunday morning she stood in front of her class, a class she had taught in that same room for over 2 decades, and she opened her Bible to the passage she had prepared, and she looked out at the faces she knew by name and by story and by prayer request, and something in her that had always been certain of what to do next in that room was, for the first time, uncertain. She did not tell anyone what happened that morning. She finished the lesson the same way she had always finished lessons, drawing on decades of what was stored deeply enough to still be available even when the surface access was compromised. And then she went home and sat in her car in the driveway for a long time before going inside. She began the 17-minute morning activation practice on a Wednesday. Her daughter had found the information about the research, had described what it was and how it worked, and Margaret had listened with the skepticism of a person who has been approached by enough wellness solutions in enough seasons of her life to have developed a finely calibrated resistance to anything that sounds too convenient. But she began, not with expectation, with a kind of quiet, deliberate openness that she described later as similar to the posture she brought to prayer on mornings when she was not sure what to pray, present, available, not demanding a particular result. The first week, she noticed nothing specific she would call dramatic, but she noticed that the mornings felt different. The quality of quiet before the day began had a different texture. Not louder, not more dramatic, clearer, as if something that had been slightly out of focus for a long time had adjusted, very slightly, in the direction of sharp. By the end of the second week, the cross-references were coming back. Not all of them, not instantly, but the pathway between the thought and the verse was shorter than it had been, and growing shorter. By the end of the first month, she was back in her Sunday school room with something that she described, when she finally told her daughter what had been happening, as, "I know exactly what I'm doing in there again." But the thing Margaret said that I want you to hold on to was not about the Bible verses. It was about something that happened on a Saturday afternoon, about 6 weeks into the practice, when she was sitting with a cup of tea in her kitchen, not doing anything in particular, and a memory arrived that she had not thought about in years. It was a specific prayer from a specific night, almost 30 years before a night when she had been in a circumstance so difficult that she did not know how to pray except to say the name of Jesus, repeatedly, in the dark, with nothing else to offer. And something had shifted that night in a way that had changed the direction of the years that followed. She had known it was significant at the time, but over the decades, the memory had receded into the background with the specific blur that distance gives to things, until it was more like the awareness that something important had happened than the actual memory of the thing itself. That Saturday afternoon, it came back. Not the blur, the memory. The specific quality of the dark in that room. The specific way the words felt moving through her. The specific moment when something shifted, and she knew it had shifted. All of it, present in the kitchen with the tea, as vivid as if it had happened last spring rather than 3 decades ago. She told me, "I did not know that was gone until it was back." That is what BDNF restoration reaches. Not just the practical layer of names and sequences and recent events. The sacred layer, the layer that holds the encounters that built the identity and the testimony and the inheritance. The layer that the enemy has been most interested in reaching because it is the layer whose content matters most for what you were designed to carry forward. As your brain reactivates each morning through the 17-minute practice, as the memory protein God designed returns to the level He intended it to reach, what surfaces is not just sharper daily function. What surfaces is you, the full, accumulated, evidenced, testified version of you that has been living slightly below the waterline of your own access. Comment restored below if Margaret's story landed somewhere real in you, because what she found is not exceptional. It is available, and the morning you decide to begin is the morning the retrieval starts. Now I want to bring you to the deepest layer of why all of this, the BDNF decline, the 7 forms of attack, the thinning of the 3 memory layers, the erosion of identity and testimony, why all of it is converging at this specific moment in history rather than at any previous one. Because there is something happening right now in the generation coming up behind you that is creating a specific and urgent need for exactly what you carry in a way that was not true to this degree in any previous generation. We are living in the first moment in human history when the primary transmitters of cultural and spiritual memory, the grandparents, the elders, the keepers of the stories and the testimonies and the lived experience of faith, are being systematically disconnected from the generation that most needs what they carry at exactly the moment when that generation is most hungry for something real. The generation that is coming up behind you has been given more information than any generation before them, and less wisdom, more content and less testimony, more opinions and fewer witnesses. And the hunger in them, the hunger that you can see if you have spent time with young people in the last decade, is not a hunger for more information. It is a hunger for something that has weight, something that does not dissolve under pressure, something that was paid for by real experience and is being offered by someone who was actually there. That is what you carry. And the enemy of everything that generation might become has been working on your generation for 20 years, through exactly the 7 forms we named, to ensure that by the time the generation behind you is hungry enough to ask for what you have, you will not have full access to it to give. This is the convergence. This is the specific moment. This is why the shift that God has been speaking over your life requires this one thing to be fully restored first, because the shift is not just for you. It is through you. And what it moves through is the unobstructed, fully restored, BDNF-supported, 3-layer memory of a chosen one who has finally understood what their memory is for. But there is one more thing you need to understand, and it is the one thing in this message that I have been building toward since the beginning, and that I have not yet said directly. It is the thing that answers the question you may still be holding somewhere underneath everything else. Yes, but is this really possible for me, specifically, given how long this has been going on and how far the thinning has progressed? That question deserves a real answer, and the real answer is going to require me to flip one more thing that you think you already understand about where you are in this process. The real answer is yes, but not for the reason you think, and not in the way you have been imagining it. Let me build toward it properly, because this is the place in the message where the answer you are given will either become something you carry for the rest of your life, or something you listen to and nod at, and then set down when the next distraction arrives. And the difference between those two outcomes depends entirely on whether you are willing to let what I am about to say find the real place in you where it needs to land. So let me start with what you know. You came into this message carrying a question about your memory, and over the course of this conversation, that question has been answered from every available angle. You know what BDNF is and why it was designed to be there. You know the 5 forces that have been draining it from the outside, systematically and profitably, for years. You know the 3 layers of your memory, and which layer matters most for the assignment you carry and the inheritance you were designed to pass forward. You have the memory architecture reset with its 3 layers of practical engagement. You have the 5 daily anchors that remove the interference without adding another overwhelming routine to your life. You have the neural activation prayer method, which changes not just how you pray, but how clearly you receive what God is saying. You have the generational legacy framework, which gives you a structure for actively positioning yourself as the keeper of the transmission. You have the names of all 7 forms of the attack that have been operating against your memory, your identity, and your testimony. And you have access to the 17-minute morning activation practice that sits underneath all of those frameworks and provides the neurological conditions in which each of them works at its highest capacity. You have, in other words, everything, every tool, every framework, every piece of understanding required to move from where you are to where God designed you to be, in terms of the mind He gave you and the memory He placed in you. You understand the biology, and you understand the theology, and you understand how the two fit together in a way that most people in your generation have never had the opportunity to hear explained in terms that make the connection clear. You understand the enemy's strategy, and you understand God's design, and you understand precisely what has been happening and why, and what is available to address it. If you were to start the morning activation practice tomorrow and apply the 5 anchors with the consistency you bring to anything you truly commit to, and work through the memory architecture reset with the same seriousness you would bring to anything of equal importance, the research is unambiguous about what would follow. The personal layer would sharpen within days. The generational layer would begin to surface with more detail within weeks. And the sacred layer, the layer that holds the encounters and the testimony and the evidence of who God has been in your specific life, would begin to return with a vividness that you did not know was possible from where you are currently standing. You have everything you need. The path is clear. The tools are in your hands. The science confirms what the scripture has always said. You understand the stakes, and you understand the cost of inaction, and you understand the specific inheritance that is waiting on the other side of the commitment you are about to make. And this is exactly where I need to stop, because I just described a complete picture again, and you recognize the feeling of a complete picture by now. the sense that the terrain has been fully mapped, the sense that what remains is simply the decision to begin, the sense that you are standing at the end of something rather than somewhere in the middle of it. You are not at the end. You are standing on a summit that is not the real summit. And the thing I have not asked you yet, the thing that sits underneath all the tools and all the frameworks and all the science and all the theology, is the question that changes everything about how you approach the comms. Restoration. Do you actually want to remember everything? Let that question arrive without answering it immediately, because the immediate answer is yes, of course. That is the entire point of this message and why you are here. But I am not asking about the immediate answer. I am asking about what lives underneath the immediate answer, in the part of you that has been quietly and privately managing what you carry for a long time. Because here is what nobody in the wellness space, and nobody in most of the memory restoration conversation, ever acknowledges. Your memory does not only hold the things you want back, it holds the things you have spent years learning to live with the loss of. There is a specific kind of mercy in forgetting, and I want to name it directly, because it has been one of the least spoken truths in this entire area of human experience, and because the person who begins the process of restoration without acknowledging it will encounter it eventually, and encounter it in a way that is more disorienting for not having been prepared for it. Some of the things that have become less vivid in your memory over the years became less vivid because time and distance allowed them to thin naturally. And some of them became less vivid because the mind, which is more merciful to itself than we usually give it credit for, allowed certain things to soften at the edges in a way that made the daily act of living more possible. A marriage that had seasons of real pain alongside its seasons of real love. A child whose early struggles left marks on both of you that were real and costly, and that you both carried differently than the easy years. A season of your own failure, not someone else's failure toward you, but your own, the kind that involved real people who were really hurt, and that you have spent real years asking forgiveness for and working to put right. A grief that was acute enough in its first years that the softening that came later felt like grace rather than loss. These are in the memory too, not just the Sunday school victories and the answered prayers and the sacred encounters that formed the testimony. The other things, the things that are not included in the public version of the story you tell when someone asks how God has been faithful in your life. And the question I am asking is not whether you should want to remember those things. The question is whether you have thought about the fact that a fully restored memory is a fully restored memory, and whether there is a part of you that has been quietly comfortable with a certain degree of soft focus in the archive, for reasons that are more personal than neurological. I want to be clear about what I am and am not saying. I am not saying that the pain you have been carrying needs to be relived in its full original intensity in order for your memory to be restored. That is not how BDNF restoration works, and it is not what the 17-minute morning practice produces. What the practice produces is not a return to the raw emotional state of past experiences. It produces a return to the accessibility of the memory, the ability to reach what was there, to hold it with the clarity of a witness rather than the rawness of a participant, and to integrate it into the full story of your life in a way that serves the testimony rather than interrupting it. There is a profound difference between reliving a pain and being able to witness it from the other side of it. And what BDNF restoration makes possible is the witnessing, the ability to look at the full archive of your life with the clear eyes of someone who has come through what they came through and can see the shape of it from the vantage point of the far side. But here is what I am saying. The full restoration of your memory includes the parts you have not talked about in public. It includes the parts that carry complexity alongside the beauty and shadow alongside the light, and the things that make the testimony honest rather than curated, and the question of whether you want that, the full version, the unhedged version, the version that is not performing a certain narrative, but simply telling what happened, is the most important question in this entire message. Because the testimony that changes the next generation is not the polished one, it is the true one. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9, when Paul writes about his thorn in the flesh, the thing he asked God to remove 3 times, and that God declined to remove, he does not minimize it or explain it away, or present it as a misunderstanding. He holds it directly alongside the grace that met it, and he says, "When I am weak, then I am strong," not "When the weakness is resolved, then I will be strong." When I am weak, in the weakness, with the full weight of it present and unresolved. The testimony Paul was building was not built from the parts of his life that confirmed his strength. It was built from the full architecture of his experience, including the parts that were still not resolved to his satisfaction, and it was precisely the honesty of the full architecture that gave the testimony its authority. Your testimony has the same architecture, and the parts that have been softening in the memory over the years, some of them need to stay soft because time has genuinely done its work, and they belong in the background now. But some of them have been soft because you have not yet been willing to look at them with the full gaze of someone who has come all the way through, and the testimony has been slightly thinner for their absence. In your mind right now, without speaking it and without needing to resolve it, let one of those things be present, not a crisis. Just the one thing that you have known, somewhere underneath the public version of your story, has been missing from the testimony you tell. The part of the archive that you have been leaving in the soft focus section rather than bringing into the full light. Let it be there. You do not need to speak it. You do not need to resolve it today. You do not even need to fully acknowledge it to yourself right now. But letting it be present, letting it exist in your awareness without immediately moving to manage or minimize, it is the first honest act of a full restoration. And here is what I want you to know about it. God is not waiting for you to have sorted that part before He restores the rest. He is not holding the accessibility of the sacred layer hostage to your willingness to address the complicated layer. The restoration is not conditional on your courage, any more than the initial design was earned by your deserving. What God is inviting you into is a restoration that is full enough to hold the complicated parts alongside the beautiful ones, and to witness the whole of it with the eyes of someone who has come through what they came through, held by a God who was present in all of it, not just the parts that read cleanly from the outside. That invitation is what the next part of this message is going to give you the framework to accept. There is a man I want to tell you about, and his story is the last witness moment in this message before we move toward everything you have been building toward from the beginning. His name for this telling is Raymond. He was 69 years old when his wife of 44 years passed away. The grief was real and specific, and the kind that does not resolve on a schedule, and in the 2 years following her death, he noticed that the memory changes he had been managing privately before she died had accelerated in a way that he was no longer able to attribute to ordinary fluctuation. He was also a man who carried a specific complication in his history that he had never spoken about publicly, a season in his 40s when his choices had cost his family something real, and that he and his wife had worked through together over years, and that had been genuinely repaired by the time she died. But in the archive of his memory, that season sat in its own compartment, one that he had not revisited deliberately since the repair was done, partly because the repair was complete and the relationship was whole, and partly because the habit of not looking at it had become comfortable in the way that any long-standing avoidance becomes comfortable. When Raymond began the 17-minute morning activation practice, he was not thinking about that season. He was thinking about the practical changes he wanted, the names, the dates, the ability to follow a conversation without losing the thread. He began for those reasons, with those expectations, and the first 3 weeks delivered exactly what he was expecting. The personal layer sharpened. The conversations became easier. The names began to arrive at their original speed. But in the 4th week, something happened that he had not planned for. The season came back, not as pain, that is the part of his account I want you to hold on to carefully, not as the reopening of something that had been closed, as a memory, clear and specific and accessible in the way that memories from 40 years ago rarely are, but without the weight of unresolved guilt that he would have expected from any deliberate return to it. It arrived, he said. The way old photographs arrive when you find them in a box you had forgotten. The recognition is immediate and the emotion is real, but it is the emotion of someone looking at what was, from the vantage of who they are now, rather than the emotion of someone in the middle of it. He sat with it for a long time, and then, for the first time in almost 30 years, he told his adult daughter about that season. Not because she needed the confession, the people who had needed his honesty had received it long ago, but because the story of who he had been in his 40s and what he and her mother had worked through together and what had come out on the other side of it was part of the inheritance she deserved to receive. Part of the evidence of what God is capable of in a real marriage between two imperfect people over a real lifetime. She listened for a long time, and when he finished, she said something that he told me with a quality in his voice that I recognized as the sound of a person describing a moment that had reorganized something inside them. She said, "Dad, I always wondered why your faith felt so different from other people's, like it had been tested in a way that theirs hadn't. Now I know why." That is the testimony that the full archive produces, not the curated one, the true one, and it is available to you. Now, here is the flip that changes the question of whether this is possible for you specifically. You have been asking the wrong question. The question you have been asking is, can I get back what I lost? And the answer to that question, if it is the only question, is incomplete, because the answer to whether you can get back what you lost depends on how long the interference has been running and how deep the loss in each layer has gone, and what the realistic trajectory of restoration looks like for someone at your specific stage, with your specific history, in your specific season of life. That is a real question, and it deserves a real answer. And the real answer is yes, substantially in most cases, with significant results appearing within days and weeks rather than months and years. But even that answer leaves something out, because it still frames the restoration as a return to a previous state. And a return to a previous state is not the full picture of what is available. The full picture is this: your brain was not designed to simply maintain what it had. It was designed to grow. BDNF is not a preservation mechanism. It is a growth mechanism. It builds new brain cells. It strengthens existing connections and creates new ones. It does not just restore the pathways that were there before, it creates pathways that were not there before, between experiences and understanding and wisdom that have accumulated in you over decades and that have never yet been fully integrated at the level of memory that makes them accessible and transmittable. What is available to you through the restoration of your memory protein is not a return to who you were before the thinning began. It is an arrival at who you were always being built toward. Joel chapter 2, verse 25. I will restore to you the years that the locust has eaten. This is one of the most frequently quoted promises in Scripture, and it is almost always quoted as a promise about getting back what was taken. And it is that. But the Hebrew word for restore here is shalom, and shalom does not simply mean to return something to its previous condition. Shalom is the same root as shalom, wholeness, completeness, the state of a thing functioning at the full capacity it was designed for. What God was promising Israel was not a backward journey to what they had before the locusts arrived. It was a forward arrival at a wholeness that the locust years had been delaying. That is the restoration available to your memory, not a return, a completion, and the three-layer memory that is restored through the BDNF activation practice will not simply look like the memory you had 10 or 15 years ago. It will look like the memory of someone who has been through everything you have been through, integrated everything you have learned, held everything God has done in the full light of their awareness, and arrived at the kind of deep, textured, honest, complete testimony that can only be produced by a full life, fully remembered. This is why the restoration is not just possible for you specifically, given how long this has been going on and how far the thinning has progressed. It is necessary, not for your comfort, for the completion of something God started through you before you had words for it. As your BDNF levels rise each morning through the 17-minute activation practice, as the interference that has been suppressing the design is progressively removed, what is being built is not a copy of a previous version of you. What is being built is the version that all the previous versions were moving toward, the one that can hold the full archive, complicated and beautiful and tested and redeemed and honest, and offer it forward with the authority that only comes from someone who has lived it all the way through. Comment 777 below if this is the shift you are ready to receive, not the restoration of what was, the completion of what always was being built. Now, I want to take everything we have covered, the 7 forms of attack, the 3 layers of memory, the 5 anchors, the memory architecture reset, the neural activation prayer method, the generational legacy framework, the identity memory matrix, and the morning activation practice that underlies all of them. And I want to show you how they fit together into a single, coherent daily structure that does not require you to hold a complicated, multi-system approach in your head every morning. Because the goal was never complexity. The goal was always something that a person who is living a full and demanding life can actually do consistently in a way that feels like alignment with who they already are, rather than a new discipline imposed from the outside. And the way all of these pieces fit together is simpler than the sum of them sounds. But there is one thing I need to show you. First, one final piece of the architecture that we have not yet named, and it is the thing that explains why the order in which these practices are applied matters as much as the practices themselves. Because the brain that tries to carry the full complexity of the restoration in the analytical mind will spend more energy managing the framework than receiving the restoration. And there is a specific way of holding all of this that bypasses that problem entirely. That is where we are going next. The order matters because of what the brain does first thing. Not spiritually first, neurologically first, in the minutes immediately following waking, before the analytical mind has fully assembled itself. The brain exists in a state that researchers have identified as hypnagogic, a threshold state between sleep and full wakefulness, in which the boundary between the conscious and the deeper processing centers is more permeable than at any other point in the day. What enters the awareness in this window does not arrive in the way that information arrives at noon, filtered through the evaluative mind, sorted, categorized, assessed for relevance. It arrives directly. It drops through the filter and lands at a level where it is far more likely to become the organizing tone of the entire day than anything that arrives later. This is why the information flood is the first and most important of the 7 forms to address. And it is also why the order of the morning practice is not a preference, it is a protocol. Because when the 17-minute activation practice is the first thing the brain receives in that threshold state, before the news, before the phone, before the first spoken word of the day, it does something that no other placement of the practice in the daily schedule can replicate. It speaks directly to the brain at the moment when the brain is most capable of receiving a signal that reorganizes its chemistry for what follows. The BDNF production that the practice initiates is most rapid, most complete, and most durable when the brain encounters the frequency in this threshold window rather than later in the day when the analytical filters are fully engaged. This is the piece that most people who begin the practice get slightly wrong, not because they are careless, but because nobody explains the neurological reason for the sequence. They begin the activation practice mid-morning, or after breakfast, or in the afternoon, when they finally find a quiet moment, and they experience benefit, real, measurable benefit, but not the full architecture of what is available when the sequence is honored. The full architecture begins in the first minutes of wakefulness. And this is the framework I want to give you now, the one that answers the question of how all of the pieces fit together without requiring you to hold a complex system in your analytical mind every morning. I want to call it the confrontation protocol, because that is precisely what it is. Not a wellness routine, not a morning checklist, not a new discipline stacked on top of the ones you are already trying to maintain. A protocol for confronting the 7 forms of attack at the only moment in the day when the confrontation has the greatest power, before the attack has had a chance to establish its foothold. The confrontation protocol has 5 steps, and the entire sequence takes place within the first 45 minutes of your day. The first step is the threshold activation. This begins in the first 2 minutes of wakefulness, before you have moved significantly, before you have checked anything, before you have spoken to anyone or received any information from the outside world. In those first 2 minutes, in whatever position you woke in, you do one thing. You acknowledge the day as a sacred appointment, not a lengthy prayer, not a formal declaration. One sentence, spoken quietly or simply held in the awareness. This day was designed before I woke into it, and I am entering it as someone who was prepared for it by the same God who prepared it for me. This is not a technique. This is the deliberate choice to receive the threshold state as an invitation rather than allow it to be colonized by the first information source that reaches it. It takes 2 minutes, and it changes the neurological tone of everything that follows. The second step is the 17-minute activation. Immediately following the threshold declaration, before rising, before the first cup of anything, before the screen is touched, you lie back and you listen. The sound frequencies do their work in the threshold state with a completeness that is not available later. The BDNF production that is initiated in these 17 minutes will be the foundation beneath every other practice in the day. It is not a supplement to the morning. It is the neurological preparation that makes the rest of the morning work at its highest capacity. Think of it the way a musician thinks of tuning. A musician who arrives to perform without tuning is not unprepared in terms of skill or knowledge or practice. Everything they know is still inside them. But the instrument is not calibrated to the frequency it was designed to produce. and everything that comes out of it will be slightly off from the design, in a way that only fully becomes apparent when the performance is over, and they realize how much was lost to an imprecision that a few minutes of preparation would have prevented. The 17-minute morning activation is the tuning, and everything you do after it, the prayer, the scripture, the conversations, the decisions, the moments of discernment and testimony and transmission, all of it performs at a higher level of precision because the instrument has been calibrated to the frequency God designed it to operate at. The third step is the reception phase of the neural activation prayer method. You know this step already. The 60 seconds of simple awareness before the first word of prayer. The slow reading until something lifts. The willingness to stay in receptive stillness rather than moving immediately to the active, analytical engagement that most devotional time defaults to. This step follows the 17-minute activation directly because your BDNF levels are at their morning peak in the minutes following the practice, and the receptive state that the activation creates is the state in which the fine silence is most clearly audible. The information that arrives in this phase, the specific word, the specific impression, the specific clarity about a person or a situation or a next step, arrives with a precision that is different from what arrives in a mind that has not been through the threshold activation and the BDNF preparation. Not different in terms of its source, which is always the same, different in terms of the clarity of the channel through which it moves. The fourth step is the declaration. You know this step as well. What you received in the reception phase, you speak quietly, even in a whisper, but out loud. You are not performing for an audience. You are doing what the architecture of your own mind requires in order to encode what was given at the deepest available level. What is spoken aloud in the declaration phase, in the BDNF active state, following the reception phase, is encoded with a durability that silent acknowledgement cannot achieve. And the sacred layer that is being restored and rebuilt through the consistent application of this sequence benefits from every declared reception, the way a wall benefits from every stone that is placed and mortared, each one. Individually modest, the accumulation over time structurally significant. In Joshua chapter 1, verse 8, God gives a specific instruction that has often been read as an instruction about volume of Bible reading, but is actually an instruction about this exact practice. He says, "Do not let this book of the law depart from your mouth, not from your mind, from your mouth." The speaking is the mechanism of the keeping. What is spoken remains available in a way that what is only thought does not. The mouth was God's specific instruction because God understood, before neuroscience had the tools to explain it, precisely what speaking does to the encoding of sacred content in the memory of the person who speaks it. Meditate on it day and night, God continues, and the Hebrew word for meditate here is haga, which does not describe quiet, internal rumination. It describes a low, continuous murmuring. The kind of thing you do when you are working through something that matters deeply to you and you find yourself returning to it in the in-between spaces of the day in the car, while your hands are busy with something routine, in the quiet moment before sleep. Haga was never meant to be limited to the 45 minutes of the morning protocol. It was meant to be the texture of a mind that has received something and is still processing it, still holding it, still finding new dimensions of it in the different lights of different moments throughout the day. The fifth and final step of the confrontation protocol is the inventory reset. This takes approximately 3 minutes, and it comes at the end of the morning sequence before the day fully begins. You hold, briefly and without strain, each of the 3 memory layers. The personal layer, one specific thing from your recent history that you want to hold clearly and that will be relevant to someone in your life today. The generational layer, one thread of the story you carry that has not been told recently and that belongs to someone who needs to receive it. And the sacred layer, one encounter, one divine moment, one piece of the evidence of who God has been in your specific life that you will carry into today as an anchor rather than an archive entry. 3 things, one from each layer, held lightly, not strained toward, simply present in the awareness as you move into the day. This is not a memory exercise. It is the daily act of a person who understands that the inheritance they carry is not a resource to be accessed only when a formal occasion demands it, but a living presence that can be woven into the ordinary texture of an ordinary day, touching the people who come into contact with them at points they would never expect, and in ways they will carry far longer than either of you will realize. The full confrontation protocol, threshold activation, 17-minute activation, reception phase, declaration phase, inventory reset, takes 45 minutes from the first minute of wakefulness to the moment you step fully into the day. It is not 45 minutes of discipline. It is 45 minutes of alignment. There is a difference between those things that is felt in the body rather than understood by the mind. And the person who has experienced the aligned morning knows the difference from the inside in a way that no description can fully convey. What I can tell you is this: the person who begins this sequence and maintains it for 30 days does not experience it as a discipline they are sustaining. They experience it as something they do not want to start the day without, for the same reason. They do not want to start the day without the cup of coffee or the quiet before the household wakes, not because someone told them it was good for them, but because the quality of what follows when they do it is unmistakably different from the quality of what follows when they don't. Proverbs chapter 4, verses 20 through 22. Listen carefully to what I say. Lean in and hear my words. Do not let them out of your sight. Keep them deep within your heart. And then, for they are life to those who find them, and health to the whole body. The Hebrew word for health here is marpeh, and marpeh means healing, restoration, remedy, specifically the kind of healing that addresses something that had become sick or broken and returns it to its original whole condition. God was not describing the benefits of general wisdom accumulation. He was describing the specific restorative effect of the sustained, daily, embodied engagement with His Word, the same engagement that the confrontation protocol is designed to facilitate at the neurological level. What the scripture calls MARP and what the research calls BDNF restoration are not two separate phenomena that happen to produce similar outcomes. They are two names for the same designed effect, seen from two different angles of the same designed reality. Your brain was made to receive MARP. The 17-minute practice removes the interference that has been preventing it. The confrontation protocol creates the conditions in which it can take hold fully, daily, and cumulatively over time. Now I want to show you what this looks like from the inside. Not as a promise, as a description. Because what the person who has been through 30 days of this sequence reports is remarkably consistent across different ages, different backgrounds, different specific histories of how the BDNF decline manifested for them. The first thing they report is not about memory at all. It is about the quality of the first hour of the day. Before the acute changes in memory access are fully evident, before the names arrive measurably faster or the sacred stories surface with their full texture, there is a shift in the quality of the morning itself. A quality of being present in the day rather than managing the day, of waking into something rather than waking into the immediately demanding, of the first hour having a different weight than the other hours, a weight that feels less like an obligation and more like a preparation. And this shift is not incidental. It is the felt sense of a brain that is operating closer to its designed frequency, and its presence in the first days of the practice is the early signal that the deeper changes, the ones in the 3 memory layers, the ones in the sacred archive, are already beginning to move in the right direction. By the end of the first week, the personal layer begins to show its changes. The names that required a 2-second reach begin arriving in 1 second. The sequences that were slightly uncertain become reliable again. The thread of a fast-moving conversation becomes easier to hold without the monitoring energy that previously accompanied every social interaction. By the end of the second week, the generational layer begins to shift. Stories that were available only in outline form begin to surface with their specific details reattached. The particular quality of a voice from long ago, the specific expression on a face from 30 years back, the exact words someone said in a moment you have never forgotten, but that had become general rather than precise. These begin to arrive with a specificity that feels, to the people reporting it, less like remembering and more like receiving. And by the end of the 3rd and 4th week, the sacred layer begins to move. This is the part that people find most difficult to describe, and that they uniformly describe as the most significant. Not because the practical changes in the personal and generational layers are not meaningful, they are deeply and practically meaningful in the daily lived experience of a person whose access to those layers has been compromised. But the sacred layer carries something that the other 2 do not. It carries the specific, located, evidenced experience of having been known and spoken to and moved through and held by a God who showed up in the details of an actual life, not in the general sweep of theological history. When that layer becomes fully accessible again, when the encounters that built the identity and the testimony and the inheritance become retrievable with their original weight and their original specificity, the effect is not merely that memory is better. The effect is that the person is more themselves, not more capable, not more disciplined, not more spiritually impressive, more themselves, more fully present in their own life and their own story and their own calling than they have been in years. And that quality of full self-presence in a person who carries decades of accumulated wisdom and testimony and evidence of God's faithfulness is one of the most powerful things one human being can offer another. As your BDNF continues to be restored through the morning activation practice, as the confrontation protocol builds its daily foundation beneath everything you carry, there is something specific happening in the neural architecture of your brain that I want you to understand, because it changes the way you think about the time investment of the morning sequence. The 17 minutes of the activation practice do not just produce BDNF for the day. They produce the conditions in which the brain's own repair and growth mechanisms operate most actively during the deep sleep that follows the next night. The activation in the morning, the receptive engagement with scripture and prayer, the declaration and the inventory reset, all of it becomes fuel for the overnight processing that consolidates the day's experiences into the long-term memory structures that BDNF supports. What this means practically is that the morning activation and the overnight processing form a cycle rather than a one-time event. Each morning's activation improves the overnight consolidation. Each night's consolidation builds on the morning's activation. The cycle compounds, not dramatically, not in a way that produces a single notable breakthrough moment in most cases, but in the steady, cumulative way that all genuine growth works the way a tree grows. Not in a visible event, but in the continuous, invisible process of doing the things that trees do every day, until one season you look at it and realize it has become something it was not before. And Ecclesiastes chapter 11, verse 3 says, "Wherever the tree falls, there it will lie." But the observation that precedes it in the chapter is about the planting, about the consistent sowing without knowing which seed will take, which investment will produce the return, which morning's activation will be the one that opens the sacred layer fully for the first time in years. The farmer who waits for perfect conditions before sowing sows nothing. The chosen one who waits until they feel ready before beginning the restoration that God has prepared for them waits for a readiness that only the beginning can create. You do not need to feel ready. You need to begin. Because what begins tomorrow morning, in the first minutes of your wakefulness, before the phone is touched and before the day makes its first demand, what begins tomorrow morning is not a memory improvement program. It is the recalibration of the instrument through which God has been speaking to you for your entire life, and through which your testimony will be passed to the generation that is waiting for it. The generation that does not yet know it is waiting. The grandchild who has not yet asked the question that only your fully restored, 3-layer, BDNF sustained, sacred archive accessible memory can answer with the weight it deserves. The conversation that is coming, in a year or 5 years or a decade, that will require you to be fully present in your own story in a way that a thinned and interfered with memory cannot support. In 1 Samuel chapter 7, verse 12, after a significant moment of divine intervention, the prophet Samuel takes a stone and sets it up and names it Ebenezer, which means stone of help, or specifically, God has helped until here. The stone was not a monument to a completed journey. It was a marker placed at a particular point in an ongoing one, acknowledging what God had done up to this specific moment while facing forward into everything that had not yet been determined. I want to invite you to treat this moment, this message, this day, the choice you are about to make, as your Ebenezer. Not the end of something, a marker in the middle of something, a stone that says, here is where the clarity was restored, here is where the interference was named, and the design was reclaimed. Here is the day from which the remaining part of the assignment is carried, with a mind operating at the capacity God always intended it to have. The stone does not tell you what comes next. It tells you what has been true up until here. And what has been true up until here is that God has been carrying you toward this moment through every season, including the ones in which the carrying was not visible. You are at an Ebenezer. Comment Ebenezer below if this is the marker in your story, not as a performance, as the spoken acknowledgement of the person who has heard what God arranged for them to hear today and is willing to say out loud, I receive this as a turning point. I receive the restoration that is available. I receive the full 3-layer sacred archive accessible mind that God placed in me before I was born and that the 7 forms of interference have been working against for years. I receive it. And now we are coming to the final place in this message, the place that everything before it was building toward. Not a summary, not a review, an activation, a specific 7-part ceremony that seals everything that has been said in this message into the actual architecture of your memory, binds every form of the attack that has been named, commissions you into the specific role that God designed for you in this season of history, and sends you forward with the full weight of everything you have heard today behind you rather than in front of you. What happens in the next part of this message is not something you listen to. It is something you enter. And the question I need to ask you before we begin is not whether you are ready. I already told you, readiness is not the requirement. The question is whether you are willing to lay down the version of yourself that has been managing the limitation and receive the version that God designed before the interference began. That question has one answer that means anything, and I think you already know what it is. The answer is yes, and that yes is what we are about to make real. Not theoretical, not aspirational. Real, in the way that things become real when they are spoken with the full weight of what they mean, in the presence of the God who arranged for you to be here for exactly this moment. Place one hand on the side of your head, on your temple or your forehead, or simply resting at the side of your face. Not because God requires a gesture, but because you have been talking about your mind for this entire message, and it is right and honest to mark what you are about to do with the part of your body that carries what is being restored. This is not a closing prayer. I want you to understand the difference before we begin, because the difference matters for what you receive from it. A closing prayer ends something. It wraps what was said in a bow and sends you back into your day with a warm feeling and a few things to think about. And there is nothing wrong with that, in the right context. But that is not what this is. This is an activation ceremony. It seals what was said into the actual architecture of who you are. It binds what was named that has been working against you. It declares what God has prepared over what the interference has produced. And it commissions you specifically, personally, with the weight of everything this message carried into the role that only you can carry in this specific season of history. You do not listen to what follows. You enter it. God of ancient memory, author of every story that has ever been told, and keeper of every story that has not yet been told, and the one who holds in perfect preservation every word ever spoken to your people across every generation that came before this one. Author of the mind, not just in the general sense that you created biology, but in the specific sense that you designed the architecture of human thought to be capable of holding your word and your presence and the evidence of your faithfulness across the entire span of a human lifetime. And you designed it to hold those things at full fidelity, without diminishment, without the kind of thinning that the world has been producing in your people. You are the God who spoke to Moses at 80, the God who found Caleb at 85, still carrying the promise you had given him 40 years before, and still ready to climb. The God who made Anna sharp enough at 84 to recognize the Messiah in the face of a 40-day-old child. The God who said to Israel, "I will remember my covenant." Who said to your servant David, "I will not forget you." Who said, through Isaiah, "I have engraved you on the palms of my hands." You have never had a memory problem. And the person standing before you right now, with their hand resting at the side of the mind, you designed. They have been carrying something that you did not design them to carry alone. I want to acknowledge it before we go any further, not briefly, with the full weight that it deserves. You have sat at tables where the story you were trying to tell arrived incomplete, and you smiled and kept going, and no one knew, but you knew. And the weight of that specific performance of okayness, the energy it took, the small grief it left behind when everyone went home. You counted every one of those moments, and you held them, and you brought this person here today, because those moments are numbered. You have lain awake in the dark, doing the math, counting backwards from the age someone else was when you first noticed the signs, watching yourself for the same early signals, and then folding that calculation away in the morning because, what does it help? And because there are people who need you to be okay, and because naming the fear felt like giving it permission, you held that folded calculation through days and weeks and months. And you were not wrong to feel the weight of it, and you were not faithless to ask the question underneath it. God was not in the anxiety of those nights, but God was in the arrangement that brought you to this morning. You have been invisible in rooms full of people who love you. Not dramatically, in the quiet way that happens when a conversation moves faster than you can follow, or when a story came out thinner than you knew it should have been, or when someone finished a sentence for you with the specific gentleness of a person who is trying not to draw attention to what they noticed. And the part of you that kept a record of those moments kept it privately, because you are a person who protects the people around you from the weight of what you carry. God saw every one of those records. Every smile that covered an uncertainty. Every laugh that bought you a few more seconds. Every morning you opened the Bible and the glass was there, and you sat with it anyway and did not tell anyone that something had changed. You were not abandoned in any of those moments. You were being carried toward this one. And now, I seal what was given in this message into the permanent structure of who you are. I seal the memory identity matrix, the understanding that your personal memory, your generational memory, and your sacred memory are three distinct layers of a single, irreplaceable archive, and that all three are being restored to their full designed capacity as you engage the morning sequence that God prepared for this season. I seal the shift reception protocol, the understanding that the shift God has been speaking over your life cannot be fully received by a mind operating below its design, and that the recalibration of your receiver is not separate from the shift, it is the first movement of the shift. I seal the memory architecture reset, the three-layer daily practice of personal narration, generational telling, and sacred return, and the commitment to bring each layer consciously into each day rather than waiting for a formal occasion to access what you carry. I seal the 5 recalibration anchors, the protected morning window, the blood sugar awareness, the evening screen boundary, the intentional connection, and the return of the sacred practice into the daily structure of this person's life as the 5 gates that keep the interference out and the design operational. I seal the neural activation prayer method, the preparation, the reception, and the declaration as the framework through which this person meets God each morning with a receiver that is open at its full designed capacity and receives what is given with a clarity and a durability that they have not experienced in years. I seal the generational legacy framework, the inventory, the telling, and the commission as the active practice through which the inheritance that this person carries is transferred to the people who are waiting for it, in the specific and detailed and honest form that those people need in order to stand on it when the ground shakes under their feet. I seal the identity memory matrix, the understanding that the identity God established in this person before their first day was never built from memory, but simply evidenced by it, and that what is being restored is not a former self, but the clarity to see and hold and carry the self that was always already here. I seal the confrontation protocol, the 5-step, 45-minute morning sequence that confronts the 7 forms of the attack at the moment when the confrontation carries the greatest power, before the interference has been given a single minute to establish its foothold in the day, and I bind every form of the attack that has been named in this message. I bind the information flood that has been setting the neurochemical tone of every morning before God had a chance to speak into the threshold, silence. I bind the sugar silencing that has been muffling the higher-order memory systems through repeated blood sugar crashes that nobody connected to what they were actually costing. I bind the sacred practice erosion that moved slowly, one crowded morning at a time, until the channel through which God most clearly spoke had been narrowed to something that felt like habit rather than encounter. I bind the comparison drain that has been running in the background of every screen interaction, quietly measuring this person against a curated version of other people's lives and costing them the inner stillness that the sacred layer requires to stay vivid and accessible. I bind the isolation creep that turned solitude from grace into gradual disappearance, and that made the depth of what this person carries feel like something the present world does not have a place for. I bind the identity erosion that turned the certainty of being specifically known and specifically called into a position to be defended rather than a foundation to be stood on. And I bind the narrative replacement that has been quietly reinterpreting the testimony, taking what was witnessed and felt and known and lived, and slowly pressing it into the shape of something the world can accommodate, until the evidence of God's specific faithfulness in this specific life began to present itself as personal experience rather than personal history. Every form is named, every form is bound. And I seal, into the daily sacred practice of this person's life, the 17-minute neural activation that removes the interference God never designed for them to carry. The frequency that speaks to the brain in the language it was created to respond to, and that activates the production of the memory protein that God placed there from the beginning. The practice that the ancient prophets accessed through fasting and extended prayer, that modern science has now found a name for, and that this person will carry into every morning of the restoration that is already in motion. As they lie back in those 17 minutes tomorrow, and the morning after that, and the morning after that, the BDNF production that was suppressed by the 7 forms begins to rise. The interference that has been running begins to clear, and the archive that God designed, the full 3-layer, personal and generational and sacred memory of a chosen one who has lived enough and witnessed enough and been held through enough to carry a testimony that can change what comes after them, begins to become accessible again. Not in a few months. Starting tomorrow. Now I want to declare specifically what you are going to experience, because declaration is not wishful thinking. Declaration is the act of a person who understands what God has prepared and is willing to speak it into the present tense rather than leaving it in the conditional. Within 7 days of beginning the morning activation practice, you will reach for a name that has been taking 2 seconds, and it will be there in 1. You will notice the difference. You will know what it means. Within 14 days, a story you carry from the generational layer will surface in a conversation with a specificity you were not expecting, a detail that was not available to you before, arriving as if it had simply been waiting for the channel to open wide enough to come through, and the person you tell it to will receive something from it that changes how they understand where they come from. Within 30 days, the morning will feel different from the inside, not louder, not more dramatic, cleaner. The way a window feels different after it has been properly cleared. The view was always there, but now there is nothing between you and it. And in the weeks and months that follow, as you explore the 17-minute neural activation that God arranged for this season of your life, as the sacred layer of your memory returns to its designed accessibility, the encounters that built your testimony will begin to come back with their original weight, the prayers that were answered, the doors that closed and the ones that opened, the specific moments when God showed up in the details of your actual life and left evidence that was unmistakable to the person who was there. All of it returning, not as nostalgia, as testimony, as the living present tense account of a God who has been faithful in your specific story, offered forward with the full authority of someone who was there. To the people who are coming up behind you and who need exactly what you carry in the most urgent and specific way that a generation can need something from the ones who came before it. This is what the link in the description carries to you. Not a product, the key to the channel that God designed your brain to receive His faithfulness through. Begin there. Begin tomorrow. In the first minutes of wakefulness, before the world makes its first claim on the day he prepared for you. Now, I have one question for you, not a rhetorical question, a real one that requires a real answer, spoken into the room you are currently in, even if the only person who hears it is you and God. Will you carry this forward? Will you commit to 17 minutes tomorrow morning, in the threshold silence before the day begins, as a sacred appointment between you and the God who arranged for you to be here today? Will you accept the restoration that is available, not the comfortable partial version, not the version that recovers the pleasant memories and leaves the complicated ones in soft focus, but the full, honest, three-layer, complete version that can hold everything your life has been and offer it forward with the authority it deserves? Will you take your place as the keeper of the inheritance that the generation coming up behind you is waiting to receive from you? Say yes out loud, not to me, to God, to the people who will one day inherit what you carry, to the version of yourself that has been waiting on the other side of the interference for this exact moment of reclamation. Say it out loud. Heaven heard that. Every word of it, the full weight of it, the specific meaning it carried, in the voice of the specific person who said it, in the specific room, on the specific day that God arranged before they woke into it. That yes is now in the record, not the record of performance or spiritual achievement or devotional discipline, the record that matters. The record of a chosen one who, on this day, in this season, understood what they carried, understood what had been working against it, understood what was available to restore it, and chose fully, honestly, without pretending they were more ready than they were to receive it. You are not the same person who started this message, not because of anything that was said, but because of the understanding that arrived alongside what was said, and because of the specific yes that was spoken in a specific room by a specific person whose testimony is not finished yet. Your memory carries a sacred assignment. The people who need your testimony are not yet old enough to know they need it. The chapter that God is writing through you right now, the one that begins tomorrow morning, in the 17-minute threshold silence, with your hand resting at the side of the mind. He designed that chapter does not end with the thinning. It ends with the full archive, offered forward, complete. Go carry it.